Hello, my dear friends. Beneath the gold of the pyramids and thrones are secrets that history books dare not mention. Pharaohs were not only kings, but also participants in bizarre sexual rituals that even the gods had to turn away. They mated with goddesses, masturbated in public squares, had sex with corpses, and turned virgins into sacrificial tools. Each act was wrapped in a sacred shell, but the truth was so naked it was chilling. Tonight, we will enter the world of sacred lust that the pharaohs had hidden for thousands of years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever believed that ancient Egyptian pharaohs ruled with sacred discipline and divine clarity, you may want to reconsider what happened behind the closed doors of their marble chambers. In the golden light of the Nile and under the towering shadows of sandstone temples, the royal bloodline was considered so holy that even love and desire had to obey its rules. But those rules did not resemble the ones most societies hold today. In ancient Egypt, the preservation of royal purity meant the boundaries between family and lover were not only crossed, they were expected to be erased. The pharaoh did not simply rule by the will of the gods. He was believed to be a god himself, and gods, in Egyptian mythology, married their siblings. So pharaohs did too. Within the royal household, marriages between brothers and sisters were formal, frequent, and highly celebrated. A sister queen was not seen as a moral concern. She was seen as the most appropriate choice for a king who needed to maintain the blood of the divine. Marrying someone outside the family risked introducing impurity into the line, so the crown often remained within the same group of royal sons and daughters, generation after generation. The daughter of a king could become the wife of her father or brother. The cycle repeated itself with little resistance. The people accepted it, the priests endorsed it, the monuments recorded it. Many modern observers assume such unions were rare or symbolic, but the archaeological records suggest they were quite real. Hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into stone walls do not shy away from these relationships. On the contrary, they proudly state them. Pharaohs introduced their sister wives with full titles. Children born of these unions were honoured, not hidden. There was no shame because shame did not exist in a system that redefined morality according to divine hierarchy. What might disturb us now was once considered the foundation of order. It was not just marriages that blurred the lines. Physical intimacy between close relatives was part of a broader ideology that merged religion and biology. If Isis could marry Osiris, then a pharaoh marrying his sister was simply imitating the divine pattern. It was an act of devotion, not deviation. Compared to the modern world, where royal families marry for diplomacy or affection, the Egyptians built their system around sacred repetition. They did not want alliances, they wanted control, and they believed that control began in the bedroom, inside the palace. Certain wings were dedicated exclusively to royal women. Sisters, half-sisters, daughters, and nieces lived together in what was called the harem, although this word carries connotations from other cultures that do not apply neatly here. In the Egyptian case, the royal women were not secluded for their protection. They were held close for a reason. They were the pool from which the next queen would be drawn, and they knew it. Girls of the royal blood were raised to expect that one day they might be summoned to the pharaoh's side not just as family, but as wives. There was no need for secrecy. Servants prepared their chambers in the same way they would for a political marriage. The ceremonies were formal, the bedding rituals scripted by priests, and the birth of any child recorded in detail. What fascinates me is how these young women were both royalty and reproductive assets in a closed loop of lineage. They carried the same divine blood as the king, and were expected to merge it with his once more. But such closeness had consequences. Over generations, this strategy of inbreeding led to health problems that became visible even in the stone-carved statues and tombs. Some pharaohs displayed physical deformities, others died young. The infamous Tutankhamun is often cited as a victim of this system. His parents were likely brother and sister. His own health was frail, his bones fragile, and his body deformed. Yet none of these risks were seen as reasons to abandon the tradition. The purity of the blood was worth more than the strength of the body, and so the practice continued, not because it made sense biologically, but because it made sense ideologically. A pharaoh was not just a man, he was the living embodiment of a god on earth. He could not marry beneath himself, but if all others were beneath him, who could he marry? Only someone of equal status. And that meant someone with the same blood, the same womb, the same name. Sometimes, the pharaoh would take multiple wives. Among them, the queen consort was usually a sister. Other women might come from noble families, foreign lands, or even servant classes, but their offspring rarely had the same status. The children of the sister wife were considered the most legitimate heirs. Even if they were physically weaker or mentally unwell, they held a higher spiritual rank. There are cases where the incestuous bond extended even beyond the initial generation. Daughters of these unions were sometimes married back to the next pharaoh, continuing the spiral. In one chilling instance, there is speculation that a father married both his sister and later, his daughter. Such patterns were not always documented explicitly, but the consistency of names and timelines leaves little doubt. It becomes difficult to tell where loyalty ended and obligation began. From the outside, the palaces looked orderly and blessed, but behind the frescoes and flowered courtyards, the emotional lives of these royals must have been complex. Sisters becoming brides, daughters are trained to love their fathers, brothers growing up beside their future wives. In a world where everyone wore gold and linen and everyone prayed to the same gods, what did intimacy mean? What did love mean? The answer, perhaps, is that those words were not central. The real goal was not emotional fulfillment, it was a cosmic balance. To the ancient Egyptians, family lines were rivers that must not merge with foreign streams. Each union between siblings was a dam built to hold back the flood of the unknown. They lived in fear of disorder, and nothing was more disordered in their view than mixing divine blood with the mortal world. The temples reinforced these ideals, stories of the gods, carved into stone, told of marriages that defied modern sensibility but affirmed sacred unity. Children in the royal family were raised on these myths. They did not question them. Why would they? The gods did it. The priests approved it. The people cheered it, and the walls remembered it. As night fell on the palace and the corridors cooled, another royal woman might be escorted down a hallway lit by flickering oil lamps. She might enter a room already prepared for her, not with romance, but with duty. Linen beds, scented oils, and a quiet silence waited for her. She was not just a sister, she was a vessel for continuity. In the next part, we will enter the heart of these royal chambers, where the official wife was not always the object of desire, and where true intimacy often happened outside the bounds of a crown. Even within the carefully maintained purity of royal bloodlines, intimacy followed a separate logic. While the official queen might hold the highest title, she did not always hold the king's attention. The sister wife, crowned with formal authority, served a purpose that was more symbolic than romantic. Her presence beside the pharaoh at rituals and public ceremonies reinforced the illusion of unity and continuity, but it did not guarantee affection or even physical closeness. The emotional weight of being queen did not come with the privileges most would imagine. She was present in portraits and inscriptions, but in the king's private chambers, she was often absent. The reality was that many pharaohs found companionship, pleasure, and escape elsewhere. The palace was filled with women of different backgrounds and ranks, each chosen for different reasons. While the queen was a product of royal strategy, the concubines and handmaidens represented more personal selections. Some were chosen for their beauty, others for their skills in dance, music, or conversation. Many came from foreign lands, sent as diplomatic gifts or acquired through conquest. These women, though lower in status, often had greater access to the pharaoh's private world than his official wife. There were no strict rules about how many women a pharaoh could keep. The number varied across reigns, but in some cases it reached into the hundreds. These women lived within the harem, a complex network of courtyards, rooms, and gardens that existed within the larger palace compound. The harem was not a prison. It was a world of its own, with schedules, tutors, and servants. Women within it were constantly evaluated. Their movements were observed. Their behaviours were shaped to match the preferences of the ruler. It was less a place of relaxation and more a silent contest for attention that never ended. Unlike the queen, who was bound by protocol, the concubines could offer something else entirely. They were expected to entertain, to comfort, and above all, to submit. This submission was not necessarily violent, but it was structured and rehearsed. Their role was to provide the king with relief from the burden of command. The moment he stepped into the inner quarters, the language of politics was replaced by something more personal. The women were trained to recognize when to speak, when to remain still, and how to react to each change in his mood. This quiet choreography became part of daily life. Compared to today's modern idea of romantic relationships built on mutual choice, these arrangements resembled performance more than partnership. The pharaoh did not need to seduce or persuade. He chose, and his choice was rarely questioned. A woman might be summoned without warning and returned to the harem without explanation. There was no expectation of consistency. A single night could mean nothing, or everything. Some of the most favoured concubines gained influence far beyond the bedroom. They were granted jewellery, estates, and in some cases, their sons were elevated as potential heirs. In a system where political power was linked to birth and affection, the mother of a well-liked child could rise quickly. Even if she had started her life in the palace as a servant or a gift from a foreign land, her fate could change with the pharaoh's favour. And this favour was never guaranteed. A woman might rise quickly and fall just as fast. Another might wait for years, unnoticed, before suddenly being summoned. The unpredictability of the king's desires kept the harem in a constant state of quiet readiness. Oils were prepared, clothing was kept fresh, and bodies were bathed daily. No one could predict when it would be her turn, but when it was, everything had to be perfect. While the queen walked beside the king in temples, the concubines existed in the shadows, but those shadows were where the real intimacy took place. Unlike the formalities of a royal marriage, the relationships between pharaohs and their lovers were often unfiltered. Some kings developed deep bonds with particular women. Others viewed them as interchangeable, but all of them understood that the queen was untouchable in one sense and unavailable in another. There were also deeper layers to this structure. Many of the women in the harem were not Egyptian. They came from Nubia, Syria, the Levant, and even farther. They brought with them new languages, customs, and appearances. For the pharaoh, this diversity offered novelty. For the court, it introduced quiet tensions. Foreign women had no traditional claim to power, but their children did. And when a son of a concubine began to gain the king's trust, factions within the palace took notice. It is strangely ironic that while the queen embodied Egyptian ideals, the real mothers of future rulers were sometimes outsiders with no voice of their own. Their value was measured by their ability to please, conceive, and disappear when necessary. No statues were raised in their honour, no poems recorded their names, and yet they shaped the bloodlines of kings. This structure created a strange duality. On one side stood the queen, silent and elevated, her image carved into temples as a model of perfection. On the other side were the many unnamed women who gave the king comfort, children, and distraction. The distance between these roles was not physical, it was symbolic. The queen was sacred, the concubine was necessary. Still, there were moments when these lines blurred. Some concubines gained so much affection that they were elevated to near equal status. A few even rivaled the queen in influence. Their quarters became more luxurious. Their sons received better tutors. Their names appeared in inscriptions, but such privilege came with risk. Envy, rivalry, and sabotage were constant dangers. The harem was not only a place of pleasure, it was a place of quiet warfare. In daily life, the queen rarely confronted these women. She did not need to. Her position was protected by birth, but that protection was not always enough. In some cases, queens were quietly pushed aside when a pharaoh's devotion shifted elsewhere. In other cases, queens retaliated, using their network of allies within the priesthood or administration to weaken their rivals. The drama of the palace was not always visible, but it pulsed beneath every decision and ritual. The pharaoh, for all his power, was at the centre of this quiet storm. Surrounded by women who served different purposes, he chose according to mood, ritual, or whim. He was not expected to love his queen. He was expected to maintain appearances. What happened in the privacy of his chambers was known only to a few, and remembered by even fewer. At the edge of this carefully arranged world stood the servants, the scribes, and the guards who saw everything but said nothing. They were the ones who lit the lamps, folded the robes, and recorded the births. They knew which woman was favoured and which one was forgotten, and in the silence of night, as the palace quieted, they watched new favourites rise and old ones fade. Beyond the royal wives and chosen mistresses, however, stood a stranger group entirely. Women who did not come from nobility or foreign kingdoms, but from slavery. And their role in the pharaoh's desires was even more unsettling. While concubines and queens manoeuvred for position within the palace, there was yet another form of intimacy reserved only for the king. It was not shared in private. It did not happen in shadowed halls or scented chambers. Instead, it was performed under sunlight, before priests, soldiers, and sometimes the watching public. It was a ritual, and it was called the Divine Union. Each year, in one of the most elaborate religious ceremonies of the New Kingdom, the pharaoh was expected to perform a sacred act that mirrored the myth of Isis and Osiris. According to legend, the goddess Isis resurrected her slain brother-husband Osiris and conceived the god Horus with him. This story, carved into temple walls and retold in festival songs, became the foundation for a public rite in which the living pharaoh symbolically became Osiris. And to complete the myth, a woman was chosen to become Isis. The union had to be acted out. The woman selected was no ordinary citizen. She was a high priestess, trained from youth to serve in sacred rites. Her education included rituals, hymns, and bodily discipline. But her most important role came on the day of the Divine Union. She would lie beside the pharaoh in a designated temple space, her body anointed with oils, her limbs arranged according to specific instructions. She was not merely pretending to be a goddess. In the eyes of the audience, she was the goddess. The setting was carefully prepared. The temple space was cleansed days in advance. Fresh linens were laid out. Incense burned constantly, masking the scent of sweat and anxiety. Stone basins held perfumed water. Statues of the gods stood at the perimeter. The act itself, though wrapped in layers of ritual, was not symbolic alone. It involved physical contact. Sometimes it involved full intercourse. The purpose was to recreate the divine conception, to bring Horus into the world once again. Even if only through performance, this event was not hidden. The court was present. High-ranking officials, priests, and military commanders were expected to witness. Their presence was not for pleasure, but for verification. If the pharaoh was to be recognized as a living god, the moment of divine union needed to be witnessed, accepted, and sealed. It was one of the few moments in history where sexual performance became a requirement of legitimacy. The priestess involved did not choose the role. She was trained for it. From the moment of selection, her life was shaped toward this one moment. She was instructed not only in rituals but in posture, breathing, and stillness. Her body became part of the temple's liturgy. In many cases, she remained unmarried for the rest of her life. Her participation in the divine union elevated her status, but it also removed her from the rhythms of ordinary existence. Compared to modern ceremonies where power is transferred through words and oaths, this ritual transferred authority through flesh. The king's divine status was not just declared, it was performed, and that performance had a physical component that few would dare imagine today. In a modern world, even the suggestion of such public intimacy would provoke outrage. In ancient Egypt, it provoked awe. The emotional effect on those involved is difficult to measure. The pharaoh was surrounded by expectations, cloaked in layers of meaning, and driven by necessity. To refuse the ritual was to refuse divinity, but to perform it was to cross a line few rulers in other civilizations ever approached. The priestess, meanwhile, had little choice. She was trained for obedience, moulded into a vessel, then asked to carry the burden of the gods. The setting itself heightened the strangeness. Light filtered through stone slats. Scribes stood at the edge, silently recording. Priests chanted verses that blurred the line between reality and myth. Guards lined the outer courts, keeping out commoners while letting selected witnesses in. No voices rose above a whisper. Every gesture was part of the performance. Every breath was calculated. The ritual did not end with the act. Afterward, the priestess was bathed and isolated. The king emerged wearing a new robe, often white or gold, and was led to the next ceremony where his divine role was proclaimed. The union was declared successful, offerings were made, feasts followed, but the heart of it all had been that private moment turned public, that intimate act elevated to theology. There are temple inscriptions that depict this ritual with coded imagery: lotus flowers, entwined snakes, or birds in embrace suggest the union without describing it outright. But other records are more direct. Papyrus texts describe the preparation, the participants, and the chants. From these, historians have pieced together a clearer picture. The divine union was not a legend, it was practice. Some pharaohs performed it multiple times during their reign. Others altered the ritual to reflect their preferences or beliefs. In rare cases, it was said that the priestess fell into a trance so deep she did not move for hours afterward. Others were honoured with new titles, temples, or servants, but their roles never changed. They had become living myths, and myths, once lived, could not be undone. What unsettles me most is the calmness with which these acts were received. There was no scandal, no outrage. For the Egyptian elite, the human body was simply another tool in the pursuit of cosmic balance. There was no divide between spirit and flesh. Everything was part of the same continuum. As strange as it seems, the ritual served a real political purpose. It reassured the court, the priests, and the people that the king was not merely a man. He had united with a goddess. He had reenacted creation. He was, at least for a moment, something more than human. The ceremony may have been annual, but its effects lasted all year. It affirmed the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. It reminded the kingdom that divine order was still intact, that their ruler had crossed into the world of the gods and returned with their blessing. Whether he believed it himself or not, the performance was completed, and that was enough. As the temple doors closed and the chanting faded, the pharaoh returned to his daily life. But for the priestess, life never quite returned to what it was. Her body had been a stage. Her role was finished. she would not be summoned again. Elsewhere in the palace, the harem continued its quiet competition. Still, in a separate wing, the foreign concubines prepared for a different kind of encounter, one that had no ceremony, no blessing, and no divine audience. The divine union was not the only time a pharaoh's body became the centre of sacred performance. There existed another ritual, one even more personal and visually arresting, that blurred the line between reverence and discomfort. Unlike the carefully choreographed scene between king and priestess, this ceremony involved only the pharaoh himself, and rather than occurring in the shadows of temple walls, it unfolded in full view, under the open sky, with priests chanting around him and spectators gathered in silent attention. It was called the ritual of fertility, and at its core was a sacred act of solitary release. Each year, when the Nile began to swell and flood the farmlands of Egypt, the people gathered to give thanks. The river's rising was not merely a natural event, it was a divine gesture. In their cosmology, the flooding was the earth's sign of readiness, a moment when the soil opened itself to receive the seed of life. And just as the land waited to be fertilized, so too did the ritual call for the pharaoh to act. His role was to represent the male principle of the gods, the generative force, the initiator of abundance, and that meant, quite literally, that he had to ejaculate. In this ceremony, the king stood on the banks of the Nile dressed in minimal ceremonial linen surrounded by offerings, priests, and royal attendants. The chants began slowly, invoking the blessings of Hapi, the god of the Nile, and Osiris, the god of life and resurrection. As the recitations reached their peak, the pharaoh approached the edge of the water, raised his hands, and performed the act. It was not done with shame or hesitation. It was done as a gesture of fertility, a sacred mimicry of divine creation. To the watching crowd, this was not vulgarity. It was a necessity. Without it, the land might remain dry, the crops might fail, the gods might withhold their favour. The pharaoh's seed, spilled into the river or onto the soil, was seen as a direct offering. It was symbolic of abundance, unity, and the unbroken cycle of generation. It is both remarkable and unsettling that one man's private release could be seen as the key to an entire civilization's survival. The act was known by many names, depending on the region and era. Some texts describe it as the spilling of royal essence. Others call it the moment of divine continuation. Regardless of the phrasing, the meaning remained fixed. Each drop was believed to carry divine energy. And more than that, it was thought to awaken the slumbering spirits of the land, as if the pharaoh's act stirred the ground beneath him to life, compared to modern rituals of gratitude, which involve prayers, hymns, or shared meals. This ceremony stands apart as a strange mix of theatrical devotion and bodily exposure. There was no curtain, no modesty. The king's body was not his own during the ritual. It was a vessel for a divine purpose. And while the public watched with solemn respect, it is likely that some experienced private confusion or discomfort, but none dared speak of it. To question the ritual was to question the river, and the river was life. Preparation for the ceremony began days in advance. The pharaoh fasted, purified himself, and performed smaller offerings. The site of the ritual was decorated with flowers, incense, and symbols of fertility such as dates, figs, and carved lotus petals. Female dancers performed soft movements on the periphery. Drummers maintained a steady rhythm, not loud, but pulsing like a heartbeat. When the moment came, silence fell. The king stepped forward, and the act began. No written accounts describe exactly how the pharaoh achieved climax, or how long the ritual lasted. The scribes focused on the significance, not the details. What mattered was that it happened. And once completed, the ceremony concluded with cheers, the release of doves, and sometimes the lowering of water jars into the Nile to collect what was believed to be blessed by the king's essence. Some scholars debate whether the ritual was always physically performed or if, In later periods, it became more symbolic, but early records, particularly from the Old Kingdom, suggest that the act was indeed literal. One passage carved into a temple wall refers to the hand of the king rising to summon growth, a poetic but pointed description. Another depicts a figure crouched near the bank, arm outstretched, fluid descending toward carved waves. This may seem unimaginable today. A ruler, exposed in public, performing an act of self-pleasure for spiritual reasons. But the Egyptian view of the body was different. It was not compartmentalized into sacred and profane. It was a tool of ritual, a participant in theology. The pharaoh's hand was not merely a limb, it was a divine extension. His seed was not just biological matter, it was sacred fluid. What surprises me most is how easily the private became public in these ancient rites. Acts that today would be considered shameful were, in that context, acts of piety. The boundaries between flesh and faith were thinner, more porous, and the king, despite his status, was not immune to vulnerability. In that moment, he stood alone, stripped of decoration, performing for gods and mortals alike, for the women in the palace, watching from afar or hearing whispered reports. The ritual might have had different meanings. It was a reminder of the king's singular role, a reminder that no matter how intimate their nights with him had been, the truest form of devotion was solitary, shared only with the earth itself. No queen or concubine could replace that moment of offering. Some later dynasties altered the ritual. They moved it indoors, they assigned proxies, but the spirit of the ceremony remained. The act of creation, even if reduced to gesture, was too important to abandon. Without it, the balance of nature and power might tip, the waters might stay still, the gods might turn away. And so each year, as the river rose, the people waited, not just for rain, or sun, or seed, but for the king to do what only he could do, to unite with the land in the most literal way, to give of himself, not in war, or law, or speech, but in an act older than kingship itself. Afterward, as the music resumed and offerings were cast into the water, the pharaoh returned to the palace. He was bathed, clothed, and escorted through halls filled with lilies and date palms. But the ceremony lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. The sight of a god, alone in his offering, could not easily be forgotten. Elsewhere, behind veils and closed doors, another kind of ritual waited, one not performed alone, but with those who could not refuse. Women chosen not for their bloodline or beauty, but for their submission. Far from the public rituals on the banks of the Nile, where the pharaoh's body became a vessel of divine fertility, there existed another rite that was known to far fewer people. It was not written on public walls or celebrated with flowers and dances. It took place in darkness, in silence, and it involved a belief so deeply embedded in the fear of death and the longing for rebirth that even those who served the king hesitated to speak of it. This was the ritual of awakening the dead, and its centerpiece was a physical union between the pharaoh and a body no longer considered alive. According to fragments of private temple texts and whispered accounts preserved in isolated tombs, certain pharaohs believed that contact with a recently deceased body could awaken the spirit trapped between worlds. Not in a body, and not any kind of contact. It had to be a woman, and it had to be done not through prayers alone, but through physical penetration. The body served as a temporary vessel, a channel for calling the spirit back, even if just for a moment. This belief, known among priests as the awakening rite, was said to return stolen power to the living and guide lost souls back toward the afterlife. It was not a public ceremony. The act was carried out deep within temple chambers or secluded underground rooms. Torches were extinguished. Only oil lamps remained, casting faint yellow light against stone walls etched with symbols of protection. The air was thick with incense made from crushed myrrh and frankincense. No audience was permitted, except for a small group of elder priests and servants trained to remain completely silent. The woman selected for this role was not a royal figure. She was often a servant or concubine from the lower ranks of the palace, young, pliable, and trained to obey. In the days leading up to the ritual, she was prepared in a specific way. Her skin was bathed in sacred oils. Her mouth was rinsed with a mixture of honey and bitter herbs. Her body was dressed in loose wrappings similar to those used in mummification. To the observer, she resembled a corpse. That was the point. Once she'd been transformed into what the priests called the silent vessel. She was taken to the ritual chamber and laid upon a slab of cold stone. Her eyes were to remain closed, her breathing was to be shallow, her arms rested across her chest, and then the pharaoh entered, alone. He spoke no words. The only sound was the low murmur of priestly chants outside the chamber. He was there to awaken, not emotionally, not spiritually, but physically. The body before him represented the border between life and death. To cross that border, he had to perform the act. It is difficult to describe how such a ceremony could be accepted even among people accustomed to sacred nudity and ritualized sexuality. The act itself was considered part of a larger cosmological cycle. Just as Osiris had been dismembered and reassembled by Isis and brought back for one final union, so too did this rite reflect the myth of resurrection. It was not called intimacy, it was called restoration. Compared to modern spiritual practices centered on candles, breathwork, or meditation, this was something colder, heavier, and far more unsettling. The priests did not see it as desecration, they saw it as an invocation. To them, the flesh was not sacred in itself, but in its ability to act as a vessel. The dead were not gone, they were paused. The right actions, at the right moment, might bring them back. No one outside the chosen inner circle ever witnessed these rites. Even within temple hierarchies, knowledge of them was restricted. Some records suggest that these rituals were reserved for moments of deep political instability, when omens suggested that the balance between worlds had been disrupted. By engaging in the awakening rite, the pharaoh demonstrated his ability to restore harmony not only in the kingdom, but between the living and the dead. The role of the woman was never recorded by name. She was not commemorated or thanked. After the act, she was removed from the chamber and placed in seclusion. In some cases, she was never seen again. It is unclear whether she was killed, banished, or simply forgotten. Some researchers believe that the ritual itself was psychologically damaging, and that the silence surrounding it was a way of erasing both her role and her trauma. What remains in the historical record are only scattered references. A broken line in a priest's manual, a painted figure lying on stone, her eyes shut, her arms crossed, a note about oil being poured on both bodies before the joining. These fragments suggest something real, something hidden behind the myths of divine kingship and public fertility. It was not beauty or passion, it was control. What haunts me most is the stillness of it. The idea that someone could lie there, fully aware, pretending to be dead, while the most powerful man in the land enacted a drama written by priests long before either of them was born. It was not a desire, it was an obligation. The king did not do it for pleasure. He did it because his advisors told him that the kingdom needed it, that the gods required it, that without it, the spirits would wander endlessly, and the fields would not bloom. The symbolism was powerful, but the human cost was invisible. The body became a tool, the soul a secondary concern, and yet, for the ancient Egyptians, this act was not considered perverse. It was considered sacred. The fear of death ran so deep, and the need for rebirth so strong, that even the line between the living and the dead was made permeable in service of order. Once the ritual ended, the chamber was sealed. The king returned to his private rooms. The priest extinguished the lamps and swept the floor with bundles of reeds. No one spoke of what had taken place. but the belief remained. A spark had been reignited, a soul had been touched, and the kingdom, in some strange and difficult way, had been cleansed. This ritual was rare, but it was not the last of its kind. In other corners of the palace, other acts of physical submission were being rehearsed, but these involved women who were very much alive, women who had no divine title, no sacred myth to protect them, and no choice in what was expected of their bodies. In a culture where the pharaoh could lie with a lifeless body in the name of cosmic restoration, it would seem that few boundaries remained. But not every act of sexuality was encouraged without restraint. There were limits, and they were enforced with quiet but powerful conviction. Among them was a rule that applied specifically to men, especially those of royal blood. It was simple in phrasing but complex in implication. No male body, under any circumstances, was allowed to bleed during sexual activity. The belief that male blood was impure once it left the body was rooted in both theology and practical symbolism. In the world of Egyptian ritual, male essence was tied to creation, fertility, and control. It was meant to flow inward or be released deliberately, not to escape through injury or rupture. Female bleeding, particularly menstrual blood, was also viewed with caution, but it had its place in the cycles of fertility. Male blood, however, had no such cycle. If it appeared, something had gone wrong. This view extended to all forms of intimacy, including heterosexual, homosexual, and ceremonial acts. Among the elite, and especially within the royal household, any encounter that risked breaking skin or causing discomfort was discouraged. This was not framed as compassion. It was framed as doctrine. A bleeding man was seen as one who had lost control of his body, and control was the very essence of kingship. As a result, sexual practices had to adapt. Positions were modified. Roles were reassigned. In some recorded cases, ritual intimacy between men, including between the pharaoh and his closest male companions, was structured in ways that minimized physical strain. Acts that might be common elsewhere were avoided entirely. The priests were clear. If blood touched the linens, the chamber had to be purified. If blood touched the floor, it was considered a stain on the ritual. What stands out is not the prohibition itself, but the anxiety behind it. The fear that a single drop of blood could disrupt the cosmic balance suggests a deep vulnerability beneath the grandeur. The male body, for all its association with dominance and power, was seen as fragile in its purity. A small rupture could invite spiritual contamination. It could invite disorder, compared to modern attitudes, which emphasize consent, communication, and emotional safety. This ancient approach was governed by an invisible framework of bodily politics. The goal was not pleasure or understanding, but preservation. Every sexual act was weighed against the potential for impurity, and impurity was a risk the royal family could not afford. This concern influenced palace life in subtle but pervasive ways. Guards, servants, and scribes were trained to monitor the physical condition of those closest to the pharaoh. If a male companion showed signs of injury, he was removed from proximity. If a favoured servant suffered a cut or wound, even one unrelated to intimacy, he might be reassigned to temple service or lower duties. There was no tolerance for unpredictability. Blood did not just stain fabric, it stained rank. In the context of male-male intimacy, this fear created a strange paradox. While it was not uncommon for pharaohs to engage in such relationships, the acts themselves had to be carefully constrained. Penetration, if performed at all, was shallow and controlled. In some cases, substitutes were used. Objects made from polished ivory or soft stone, carved with symbolic shapes, were employed in place of direct contact. These objects were considered safer, cleaner, and more manageable. It was also common to assign ritual roles that placed one man in a passive position, often referred to in temple records as the receiver of breath. This title suggested spiritual submission rather than physical dominance. The act was choreographed to emphasize symbolic transfer rather than bodily pleasure. The goal was unity, not climax. What intrigues me most is how the fear of contamination shaped not just rules, but behaviours and identities. To be penetrated was not shameful in itself, but to bleed was. To show signs of damage was to suggest weakness, and in a system where weakness had no place, men learned to conceal, adapt, and in some cases, abstain. This extended even to grooming. Royal men, especially those serving in ritual or intimate roles, were kept under constant physical inspection. Their skin was shaved, their nails were trimmed. Any abrasions or signs of inflammation were noted by palace healers. Ointments made from beeswax and lotus resin were applied to prevent chafing or infection. There was an entire science, built in silence, designed to keep the male body intact. Priests sometimes served as enforcers of this purity. Before certain ceremonies, they examined the participants, not just for cleanliness, but for signs of bleeding. Even a cracked lip could lead to dismissal. The emphasis on seamless flesh became part of the larger obsession with unbroken order. Just as a chipped statue had to be restored, so too did the body need to remain whole. These restrictions may seem excessive, even oppressive, but they were consistent with a worldview that feared disorder above all. Egypt was a land built on the rhythm of the Nile, on the certainty of cycles. Anything that fell outside that rhythm was suspect, and nothing disrupted the rhythm more than uncontrolled bodily fluids. This belief also affected how punishments were administered. When a male servant or consort was disciplined, it was done with soft implements, wooden rods wrapped in linen, flat paddles carved from palm wood, or bundles of reeds soaked in water. The goal was to bruise, not cut. Pain was allowed, blood was not. A bleeding servant was a problem. A bleeding noble could be a scandal. Even the tombs reflect this concern. Male mummies were often wrapped with additional care. Special resins were used to seal the skin. Internal organs were removed with minimal incision. The belief was that a male body should return to the earth as intact as it had lived. To arrive in the afterlife with a cut or open wound was to arrive impure, and so the rituals continued. Intimacy remained, but always under watchful eyes. A kingdom ruled by gods could not tolerate weakness, even in flesh. The pharaoh's power rested not just in his crown, but in the illusion that his body was untouchable, immaculate, immune. But not everyone in the palace could afford such precautions. In the outer halls, away from the perfumed chambers and polished stone baths, there were other bodies, foreign bodies, unprotected ones. They bled when touched, and no one stopped to clean it. While the royal men were shielded by layers of ritual and rule to protect their bodies from the smallest wound, others in the palace system were not granted such concern. For them, the body had no boundaries. There was no protection, no inspection, and no priest waiting to stop a violation. Among the most silent figures in this elaborate structure were the slaves assigned to the temples, particularly the women selected for a function rarely recorded in official history. They were not there to clean or chant or light incense. They were offered to the statues of gods as vessels of stimulation. In several sacred sites, especially those dedicated to fertility deities like Min or Hathor, rituals involved the physical presence of female slaves whose role was to awaken or maintain the divine energy of the god's image. The statue itself, often carved from stone or wood and overlaid with gold leaf, stood at the centre of the sanctuary. It represented the god, not as a symbol, but as an active, living force. And for that force to remain potent, it had to be aroused. To do this, women were chosen and trained in how to stand, how to breathe, and how to remain still for long periods. Their clothing, if it could be called that, was made from transparent linen soaked in oil to cling tightly to the skin. Their hair was perfumed and shaped into coils. Their bodies were positioned into specific poses, often with hips forward, arms raised, or legs spread slightly apart. These stances were not random. They followed a script known only to the temple keepers. Each pose corresponded to a different divine mood. These women were not allowed to speak during the ceremony. They were told to look at the statue, never away. They could not flinch or shift, even when the air grew cold or insects landed on their skin. They were expected to become living extensions of the god's desire. The priests called them receivers of presence. The term suggested a passive role, but the reality was more active, more invasive, and more enduring than the word implies. What strikes me most is the intensity of stillness these women had to maintain, not as a meditation, but as a performance of complete surrender. They were required to embody not devotion, but invitation. Their very posture had to signal that they were available, that they had no will of their own, that their presence was an offering, compared to modern religious rites, where symbolism often takes the form of candles or chants. These practices used human bodies as direct tools of worship. There were no metaphors. The message was physical. The gods did not require offerings of food or incense alone. They required stimulation, and this stimulation came through the flesh of those with no voice. In certain festivals, the acts extended beyond the symbolic. In rare and disturbing instances described in obscure temple records, priests physically interacted with the women under the pretense of transferring divine energy. The logic was always the same. The god's spirit entered the statue. The statue's desire transferred to the priest. The priest's touch transferred it to the woman. In this chain of reasoning, consent disappeared. Not every temple practiced this. Not every era allowed it. But where it occurred, it was recorded with formality, never shame. One scroll from a temple in Thebes describes the hour when the god becomes restless, followed by a list of poses and positions for the slave attendants. Another, now fragmented, lists names of women next to dates and locations, as if they were part of an inventory. No prayers for their safety, no rituals for their return. The most disturbing element may be the quietness of it all. These women were not considered participants. They were considered tools. The priest who placed them before the statue did not speak to them. The guards who watched did not interfere. The other temple staff turned away. This silence became part of the ritual. Noise was believed to distract the god. Only the sound of drums or low flutes filled the chamber. Everything else remained still. After the ceremony, the women were led back into isolation. Some were bathed in salt water to remove divine residue. Others were left unwashed, as if to preserve the contact. No medical care was provided unless they collapsed. In a few temples, those who fainted during the ritual were labelled as too mortal and removed permanently. Their usefulness ended the moment their bodies stopped cooperating. It is hard not to see this practice as the collapse of spirituality into exploitation, where devotion became indistinguishable from abuse. The belief in divine hunger, so central to Egyptian theology, allowed these acts to persist. The god desired. The statue was received. The woman obeyed. These temple slaves were not always native Egyptians. Many were taken from conquered lands. Their foreignness added to the mystique. Priests believed that women from distant regions held different energies, perhaps more potent or more receptive. Their skin was unfamiliar. Their tongues are foreign. Their presence is exotic, and therefore ideal for divine service. No part of their background was relevant once selected. They were renamed, their pasts erased. Their roles are defined entirely by ritual. Even their menstrual cycles were monitored, not for health, but for scheduling. A woman who bled was unclean. A woman who ovulated was ideal. They were moved from one temple to another, sometimes loaned between cities, depending on the needs of the god and the confidence of the priests. And yet, their faces remain invisible in history. No statue was raised for them. No tomb honoured their service. They were not wives, not queens, not even concubines. They were the hands, the hips, the breasts that the gods were believed to gaze upon, and when the ritual ended they vanished behind veils, replaced by others. The pharaoh himself rarely attended these ceremonies. His role in temple life was more symbolic, more distant, but he approved the structure that allowed them. His priests acted on his behalf. His silence gave permission. This intersection of worship and violation created a space where belief could excuse almost anything. The women were not considered harmed. They were considered elevated. To be touched by a god, even indirectly, was framed as an honor. But the body remembers. The muscles that trembled from hours of stillness. The lungs that held breath through suffocating incense. The eyes stared into the hollow gaze of a golden statue. These women carried the weight of gods, not in crowns or titles, but in silence. Outside the temple walls, other rituals unfolded with less ceremony but no less control. There, the purpose was not to awaken divine energy, but to create heirs, and for that, even blood ties were no longer a barrier. In the inner sanctuaries where temple slaves stood as offerings to statues, belief often overpowered hesitation, and in some rare, deeply guarded rituals, belief went even further. There existed ceremonies so secluded and controversial that even within the Egyptian priesthood, their existence was known only to a limited few. These were not rituals of public spectacle or royal display. They belonged to an older layer of theology, one that dealt with fertility in its rawest, most primal form. And at the centre of some of these rites was a concept almost impossible to process today: sacred union with animals. To understand how such an idea could have taken root, one must consider the symbolic weight animals carried in Egyptian religion. The gods themselves were often depicted with animal heads. Bulls represented virility. Donkeys carried associations with stubborn strength. Cats, crocodiles, and falcons each embodied divine traits. Statues were not simply carved to resemble these creatures. The animals themselves, in many cases, were believed to carry fragments of the gods. A bull chosen by the temple could be more than a beast. It could be the physical vessel of a deity. The ceremonies involving animals were not widespread. They did not occur in every city or temple. But certain surviving texts and fragmented oral traditions suggest that in isolated regions, particularly during seasonal fertility festivals, rituals took place where human participants were instructed to engage with animals in acts meant to reflect the union of nature and divinity. These were not punishable crimes in the ancient world. They were viewed as sacred reenactments of the forces that drove life itself. The participants were never commoners. They were temple specialists, often women raised within the religious system from childhood. Some were called divine attendants. Others were ranked among the lesser priesthood. Their roles in public rites involved singing, dancing, or performing cleansing duties. But in these hidden ceremonies, their duties shifted. Their bodies became tools of invocation. What makes this practice even more disturbing is that it was not spontaneous or chaotic. It was carefully arranged, timed, and performed under supervision. The temple prepared the space. The animal was selected and cleansed. The participant fasted, bathed in milk and honey, and was anointed with lotus oil. Robes were removed. The animal was tethered in place. And then the act was carried out. Compared to symbolic fertility rites in other ancient cultures, where acts were mimed or suggested, this went further into territory that modern ethics cannot reconcile. The union was not figurative. It was believed to generate a field of energy, to stimulate the ground, to echo the mythical moment when gods first shaped flesh and breath. No audience was allowed, but a small group of elder priests and temple scribes stood nearby. Their presence was not voyeuristic, it was official. They were witnesses, tasked with affirming that the ritual had taken place correctly. These rites often aligned with agricultural cycles, the start of the planting season, the arrival of the floods, or a solar event might serve as the justification. The logic was circular. The god lives in the animal. The priestess unites with the animal. The god is awakened through her. The land responds. Crops grow. Balance is restored. The animal was never killed afterward. That would violate the sanctity of the act. It was usually led back into isolation, fed with special offerings, and watched closely. It became sacred in a new way, having now been touched by both God and humans. In some temples, such animals were buried with honours once they died, wrapped in linen and placed in tombs alongside sacred relics. For the women involved, there is no record of consent or resistance. Their names are not preserved. Their experiences are not described. What survives are only the clinical accounts of what they were meant to do. A stone relief from a temple in a remote province shows a woman kneeling before a horned creature. Her face is calm. Her body is stylized into curves and angles, like the gods themselves. Another shows a donkey surrounded by glyphs for fertility, rhythm, and breath. These images are rare, buried in lower walls, almost as if intended to be forgotten. The priests who designed these rituals spoke of them as restorations, not violations. They claimed that the world had grown barren, and that only the most ancient rites could revive it. These were acts of desperation cloaked in theology. The earth had to be shocked into blooming, the gods had to be stirred from sleep, and for that, the boundaries of the human had to be crossed. What unsettles me is the calculated way these rituals were preserved, not as myth, but as instructions. There was nothing metaphorical about them in their original context. They were treated with the same seriousness as burial rites or coronations. The difference was that they happened out of sight, known only to a small network that passed them from one generation to the next. Over time, the ceremonies faded as Egypt changed, as new dynasties emerged, and as foreign influences entered. These acts were buried, first metaphorically, then literally. The scrolls describing them were lost or destroyed. The temples that housed them collapsed. The participants died unnamed, but echoes remain. Fragments of script, incomplete drawings. Vague accounts in later texts refer to the union of beast and vessel. These remnants point to a world where the sacred and the profane were not opposites, but neighbours, where faith could be stretched to justify what would otherwise be unthinkable. The women who took part were not called victims, they were called chosen, and that title erased everything else. The pharaoh himself rarely took part in these ceremonies, but he sanctioned them, he funded them, he approved the training of the priestesses. In doing so, he allowed the line between human and animal, worship and submission, to be crossed in the name of life itself, and while such rites may have disappeared from the temples, their spirit did not vanish. In other corners of the palace, new methods of ensuring fertility were devised, methods that involved not animals, but blood, not from ritual creatures, but from within the most guarded female bodies of the royal household. As rituals involving sacred animals faded into secrecy and eventually silence, another set of practices remained firmly rooted in the daily life of the palace. These did not take place in distant temples or under the watch of elite priests. They happened in bedrooms, in bathing chambers, in small bowls hidden behind silk curtains, and their focus was on a substance long viewed with ambiguity in almost every civilization: menstrual blood. To the ancient Egyptians, blood was not just a liquid. It was life, will, and power in physical form. When it flowed from a wound, it symbolized vulnerability. When it was spilled in battle, it signified sacrifice. But menstrual blood belonged to a different category altogether. It was a monthly reminder of potential life, yet also a mark of exclusion. In religious terms, it was often viewed as unclean. But in the palace, among certain queens and favoured priestesses, it became something else entirely, a tool of control. Some texts describe the belief that the blood of a virgin or royal woman carried divine properties. It was said to hold raw, untamed energy, capable of stirring desire and unlocking hidden parts of the male mind. If properly harvested and mixed with wine, it could become a potion, potent and persuasive. This mixture was not given in an open ceremony. It was offered in private, often disguised. sometimes used just before a night of intimacy. The king or prince would drink from the cup, unaware of the ingredients, or perhaps fully aware and complicit. The logic behind it was not based on deception alone, it was spiritual. The blood was believed to represent untapped fertility, something that had not yet become life but held the power to create it. When combined with alcohol, that essence was activated, made fluid, and made ready to enter the body of a man. It would not impregnate him, but it would bind him, symbolically and emotionally, to the woman who provided it. What makes this belief especially striking is the reversal it created. In a world where men controlled nearly every visible structure of power, this ritual gave women a hidden advantage. They could affect kings not through argument or seduction, but through biology. Their bodies became sources of manipulation, not just reproduction. The queen who provided the blood became more than a wife. She became a source of influence that extended far beyond the bed. Compared to modern practices of seduction or cosmetic enhancement, this was rawer, less symbolic, and more direct. There was no perfume, no dance, no veil, just the body, and the belief that what left it could return through another's mouth and change his thoughts. Some queens are said to have taken this even further. Instead of mixing the blood into drinks, they bathed in it. The practice, according to isolated temple scrolls and later medical papyri, involved collecting the monthly blood of virgins or selected concubines and pouring it into warm water mixed with oils. The queen would then immerse herself, remaining for up to an hour. This was not a cleansing bath. It was absorption. The goal was to soak in the power, to take back what had been lost. It was thought to preserve beauty, awaken sexual confidence, and ward off rivals. There is no evidence that these baths were frequent. They required time, secrecy, and resources. The collection itself involved silent cooperation. Young girls were selected, often unaware of the purpose. Servants harvested the blood using strips of linen, then soaked and wrung them over clay basins. The material was burned afterward to prevent its use by others. The bath was prepared in silence. The room was dark. No mirrors were allowed. Only oil lamps flickered along the tiled walls. The queen entered alone, sometimes accompanied by a single attendant who remained blindfolded. She removed her robe slowly and stepped into the reddish water, inhaling the metallic scent mingled with rose petals and myrrh. She did not speak. She closed her eyes, and for a short time she believed herself untouchable. No songs were written about this ritual, no frescoes recorded it, but its impact lingered in court stories and whispered memories passed between generations of female servants. They spoke of queens who kept their position longer than others, whose eyes made even the pharaoh hesitate, whose voices echoed louder despite speaking less. What fascinates me most is how these private acts created real consequences in public life. A king might change his decision, a general might be denied access, a concubine might disappear, and no one could explain why. But the queen's gaze told its own story. Some scholars have tried to dismiss these practices as legend. They argue that such rituals are unlikely, unproven, or exaggerated. But ancient Egyptian culture thrived on blurred boundaries between gods and men, between myth and rule, between the physical and the spiritual. It is not difficult to imagine that in a world obsessed with order, a woman might find her own way to assert power. Even the concept of purity in Egyptian thought was flexible. What one priest called impure, another called sacred. Menstrual blood sat on that line. It could exclude a woman from temple duties, yet elevate her in the eyes of those who believed in its hidden strength. That duality was not accidental. It allowed women to operate from the margins, always visible, always dangerous. There is no record of how the men felt about this. No writings express disgust or desire, but the silence itself speaks volumes. In a kingdom ruled by rituals and omens, a king who drank from the cup could not admit what he had swallowed. To speak it was to lessen it. To ignore it was to remain under its influence. These rituals rarely reached outside the palace. They were not for common women, not for the market or the village. They belonged to the upper halls, the marble floors, the scented corridors, and within those walls, power moved in whispers, in scents, and in fluids too taboo to name aloud. Just beyond these private chambers, however, another transformation was taking place. A new ritual, louder and more theatrical, had begun to redefine how death and sexuality could merge again, not through liquid, but through silence and stillness. While some royal women turned to secretive potions and sacred bathing to assert power during the pharaoh's life, others were summoned for a far stranger duty at the very moment his life ended. Death in ancient Egypt was not a sudden rupture, but a passage. The body was not just prepared for burial, it was accompanied, and among the many rituals surrounding royal death, there was one that stood apart for its intimacy, its scale, and its silence. It was called the warming of the soul. The ritual began the moment the pharaoh's final breath was confirmed. His body was not immediately removed to be embalmed. Instead, it was laid out on a ceremonial platform, washed in oils and surrounded by flowers and burning myrrh. Attendants cleared the chamber of men. Only selected women were allowed to enter, and they were told to remove their garments. Not one, not a few, dozens. The idea behind this mass disrobing was not purely symbolic. It was believed that the warmth of the female body and its natural connection to life and reproduction could assist the soul in reorienting itself. The newly departed spirit, confused and lingering, might be coaxed to begin its journey if it sensed the familiar pull of pleasure, sorrow, and desire. In this view, the body was not a corpse. It was a vessel suspended between two realms, and the women became the bridge. The participants included royal concubines, palace servants, and sometimes even noble daughters sent by allied families. Each had been prepared for this role well before the moment arrived. They were trained to express grief in a stylized way, moaning, rocking, swaying in rhythm. But alongside the mourning came another instruction: touch, whisper, stimulate. A few were selected to lie beside the corpse, pressed skin to skin. One or two were guided to straddle the body, moving slowly, eyes closed, mouth silent. What strikes me most is the convergence of grief and intimacy in this space, where emotion and ritual became indistinguishable. These women were not offering affection, they were offering passage. The belief was that a dead king might hesitate to leave if the body remained cold, but if it was warmed by human contact, if it was surrounded by familiar forms and the scent of life, the soul might loosen its grip and rise. Compared to modern funerals, which separate the physical from the ceremonial, this rite pushed both together into a single, unsettling moment. There were no prayers from a distance, no hands folded in silence. Everything was immediate. The tears were real. The touch was structured. The heat of the living was given freely to the dead. Descriptions of the ritual come from a book known in fragmented form today as the Book of Divine Rebirth. Preserved in tomb walls and scratched into temple columns, it refers to the gathering of the body's breath, a process that involves female mourners encircling the king's form and calling the soul with their warmth. One line, damaged but still legible, instructs the women to move without sound, to remind the flesh of its journey. Another warns not to stop until the skin grows cold again, a sign that the spirit has lifted. There is no mention of male participation. The role of men in the ritual was limited to preparation and protection. They escorted the women in. They stood guard outside. They lit the lamps, but they did not witness the act itself. This was a rite of women, both sensual and sacred, hidden from male eyes and recorded only in symbols. The chamber where this took place was never reused. After the ritual, the body was transferred to the embalming table. The room was sealed. Sometimes it was destroyed. The women were led away, bathed in silence. Some returned to the harem, others vanished from the record. In rare cases, inscriptions list a woman's name with the title "She Who Warmed the Throne," a phrase that carried quiet power but no further explanation. The ritual was not seen as improper, it was seen as necessary. Just as the pharaoh had entered the world through a woman's body, he would exit the world surrounded by them. The body may have been lifeless, but the act was not about reanimation. It was about guidance. One final push from the realm of flesh into the realm of gods. There are no drawings of this ceremony. No temple murals show the act, but scattered accounts mention it in coded language. The chamber of return, the circle of open breath, the night of unveiled sorrow. Each phrase hints at a practice that was never public, but never forgotten. What haunts me is not the ritual itself, but how calmly it was integrated into royal transition. The women were not forced in the modern sense, and they were expected. They had trained, and yet they were touching a body that could not respond. They were performing desire not for pleasure, but for passage. It is difficult to know how they felt. No words remain from their voices, only instructions carved by someone else. The logic of the rite followed the broader Egyptian obsession with continuity. Death was a disruption. Sensual contact was a reminder of what was lost. By recreating it, even briefly, the illusion of wholeness returned. The soul, comforted by familiarity, might rise in peace. The state continued. The world did not fracture. After the body was removed, the women did not speak of what they had done, not even to each other. The ritual was a threshold. Once crossed, it stayed behind. But its energy carried into the burial, into the tomb, into the stories whispered by priests and written in ink that faded more slowly than memory. Outside the tomb, the living prepared for the next reign. A new pharaoh would soon ascend. And with him, the cycle of sacred intimacy would begin again. This time, not in death, but in the blood of his first union. A union that, by tradition, would not involve a stranger but someone born of the same womb. The transfer of power after a pharaoh's death marked not only a shift in titles, but a renewal of the entire palace structure. A new ruler meant new rituals, new appointments, and often, new women brought into the royal household. These women did not arrive with fanfare. They did not walk through golden arches or ride in perfumed litters. Most came quietly, through side gates, guided by senior attendants and cloaked in plain linen. They came not as wives or mistresses, but as servants, offered by noble families or collected from surrounding provinces. Before they could take up any task, however simple, they faced a ritual that defined the start of their life inside the palace. It was called the unveiling. The moment they entered the palace courtyard, their names were taken, their clothing was removed, they stood bare under the sun or beneath stone ceilings, their eyes cast downward. The inspection was not conducted by soldiers or male officials. It was led by the queen herself, assisted by senior female priests whose roles blended the medical and the divine. These women did not smile. They did not offer comfort. They moved with precision and authority. The first purpose of the ritual was purity. Each girl's body was checked for signs of sexual activity. This did not always involve physical examination. Sometimes it was inferred from demeanour, posture, or subtle reactions to touch. In other cases, more direct methods were used. Linen soaked in sacred oil was pressed against their thighs. Their breath was monitored for quickness. Their responses were judged silently, then recorded. But virginity was not the only concern. The body itself was studied for signs of divine compatibility. The priests believed that certain forms aligned more closely with the needs of the palace gods. Wide hips were seen as a sign of fertility. Straight posture indicated discipline. Certain facial proportions were thought to reflect balance, an essential trait in temple service. Even skin tone played a role, not for beauty, but for symbolic resonance with specific statues or shrines. What makes this ritual particularly unsettling is how it turned the female body into a landscape of evaluation, a surface upon which power could be projected or denied. These girls were not judged as people, they were judged as instruments, either suitable for service or in need of redirection. Compared to modern employment screenings or background checks, this process was profoundly physical, immediate, and irreversible. A single perceived flaw could reroute a girl's fate permanently. There was no appeal, no discussion, and no protection. Those who passed the inspection were taken into a separate hall. There, they were clothed in standard palace robes, taught the rules of movement and silence, and assigned to minor duties. Some worked with incense. Others cleaned ceremonial tools. A few were trained as dancers or singers. Over time, they might rise in rank, gaining access to the inner rooms and with it, proximity to the ruler. Those who failed were not expelled. They were redirected. Most were handed over to the temple departments that served the statues of the gods. These girls did not live in the palace. They were relocated to temple annexes, often in smaller cities. Their role changed entirely. They were trained not to serve humans, but to please carved representations of deities. This did not mean standing beside the statue with offerings. It meant acting as vessels of divine stimulation. The same rituals described in earlier temple practices applied here. Transparent robes, long hours of motionless standing, and occasional physical contact orchestrated by senior priests. The girl was no longer a servant. She was a conduit. Her body, once found unworthy for the palace, became the means by which gods were believed to receive attention and energy. No one returned from that path. Once transferred, the girl's name was altered in temple records. Her family was not informed. In rare cases, if a girl was especially beautiful or responsive, her image was preserved in sketches stored deep within temple scrolls. These images were not portraits. They were diagrams of posture, angle, and expression. The initial unveiling thus served as more than a test. It was a fork in the road. From a single moment of vulnerability, entire futures were shaped. The girl who trembled might be marked as weak. The one who remained too still might be labelled cold. The evaluation was not scientific. It was spiritual. The body was read like a text, and every scar, every blemish, every silence was interpreted. Some accounts suggest that the queen herself rarely spoke during these inspections. Her presence was symbolic, a reminder that the hierarchy of women within the palace could be as rigid and unforgiving as any male-dominated court. She did not protect the girls. She preserved the structure. After the inspection, the girls were not comforted. They were bathed again, this time in cold water. No words were spoken. Their previous clothes, often their last possessions from the outside world, were burned. What remained was a body, clean, anonymous, and ready to serve. What disturbs me most is not the exposure but the silence that surrounded it. No one wrote down how the girls felt. No one recorded their thoughts. The ritual was considered routine, necessary, even sacred. But the emotional weight carried by these young women, stripped and inspected by strangers, will never be fully known. The process reinforced a deeper truth about the Egyptian court. Power did not always come from titles or bloodlines. It came from proximity, and proximity began with access. To be allowed inside the palace walls was a privilege, but that privilege had a price, and for many girls, that price was their autonomy. Once inside, their bodies no longer belonged to them. They belonged to a system that evaluated, redirected, and consumed them based on needs far beyond their understanding. Some adjusted, others disappeared quietly into the machinery of ritual. This unveiling ritual was not isolated. It was part of a broader network of bodily assessments and reassignments that defined the lives of women in ancient Egypt's royal world. And in the next chamber over, another test awaited. One that involved no inspection, no judgment, and no choice. Only obedience, a single candle, and a man in robes with the power to approve or condemn. The unveiling of new palace servants was not the only ritual where bodies were laid bare and futures decided in silence. Beyond the palace walls, in the quiet corridors of temple complexes, a different kind of initiation unfolded. It involved no royal blood, no throne, and no golden mask, but it carried equal weight. In the temples of ancient Egypt, where divine service was seen as the highest calling, one did not become a priest through knowledge or belief alone. The transition required proof, and that proof came in the form of flesh. Before a man could be formally accepted into the priesthood, he had to undergo a ritual known in the Inner Temple scrolls as the joining of souls. This act, carried out between a male candidate and a senior female priestess, was not symbolic. It was physical, it was sexual, and it was considered essential to strip the man of his mortal confusion and align him with sacred purpose. The male candidate would be brought into a secluded chamber after a series of preliminary cleansings. He had fasted for several days, bathed repeatedly in salted water, and had been forbidden to speak for 24 hours. His head was shaved, his body was oiled. He wore only a narrow linen wrap and carried a single lotus flower in one hand. The woman who met him was not a stranger. She was a senior priestess who had already completed decades of service. Her body was aged, but that was the point. She had shed personal identity. She represented the goddess in her full form, not youthful or seductive, but wise and eternal. Her role was not to receive pleasure, but to transmit it through intention. She guided the act, not with tenderness, but with certainty. The room where this ritual occurred was carefully arranged. Cushions lined the stone floor. Lamps burned with thick blue smoke. Symbols of the goddess Hathor were carved into the walls. There was no music, no prayer, no audience at first. Only one person entered after the act had begun, a temple scribe with a reed brush and a roll of papyrus. What makes this ritual especially difficult to imagine is how it framed intimacy as a rite of erasure. The man was not allowed to speak, not allowed to express desire, not allowed to question. His arousal was not personal, it was demanded. The priestess was not present as a partner. She was present as a vessel of transformation. Together, they performed what the priest called the exchange of boundaries, compared to modern religious initiation rites, which often involve vows or symbolic gestures. This ritual required the full surrender of bodily autonomy in the name of spiritual alignment. The physical act was seen as the moment the man shed his identity as a layperson. After climax, he was expected to weep, not from emotion, but from the release of ego. If he remained composed, the ritual was considered incomplete. The scribe, seated a short distance away, did not record words. He drew the outlines of the act. He captured the curvature of bodies, the placement of limbs, and the sequence of movement. These sketches were not preserved as art, they were stored as proof. Should the man's spiritual integrity be questioned in the future, the scroll could be produced to show that he had undergone the rite properly. In some temples, these scrolls were kept for generations. In others, they were burned immediately after the candidate was accepted, as a final offering to the gods. But the moment itself was never spoken of again. It became a memory shared only between the priest, the priestess, and the silent scribe whose brush documented the transformation. The ritual was not optional. Refusal meant permanent exclusion from temple service. A candidate who resisted might be redirected to agricultural duties or minor guard roles. His name would be removed from training lists. In extreme cases, he would be given to the labour force that maintained temple grounds. No punishment was given, no explanation, only silence. Some candidates did not resist but failed to perform. In these cases, temple healers were summoned to administer herbal stimulants. If arousal still did not occur, the candidate was marked as spiritually blocked and dismissed. The act of physical readiness was interpreted as divine approval. A failing body was seen as a sign that the soul was not yet ready to serve. The priestess who performed the act did not change roles after the ritual. She remained in her post. She carried on with daily duties, leading chants, interpreting omens, and overseeing sacrifices. The act did not elevate her. It was considered part of her service, and if she found the task unpleasant or painful, she was not permitted to speak of it. The ritual demanded detachment from both participants. What I find most revealing is the level of bureaucracy layered over such an intimate act. The presence of documentation, of scheduling, of post-ritual reporting turned something deeply human into a form of administration. The body became a checklist, the soul became a requirement, and the act itself became a transaction that was remembered only as data. The ritual's origins are unclear. Some believe it began during the Middle Kingdom, when the temple hierarchy became more formalized. Others trace it to older fertility rites that were later absorbed into priestly culture. Regardless of its beginnings, by the time of the New Kingdom, it was institutionalized. Every major temple had a chamber set aside for this purpose. Every class of priest included men who had passed through it. No records exist of any woman refusing to perform the rite. Whether by duty, pressure, or belief, they all participated. The younger priests did not speak of it among themselves. They were told that speaking diminished the sanctity, that remembering it too clearly meant it had not worked. And yet, despite the silence, the ritual left marks, not physical ones, but behavioural. Men who had passed the rite often moved more slowly. They kept their eyes down. They held their hands close to their bodies. Some looked at the priestess afterward with fear, others with reverence, but always with distance. The rite served its purpose. It broke the man, not in punishment, but in preparation. The ego was removed. What remained was a vessel, ready to carry incense, to interpret dreams, to enter temple space without carrying the stink of personal ambition. And once they had crossed that threshold, another awaited, a ritual with no priestess, no sketch, and no privacy at all. Only the young man, a mirror, and a sharp object he would have to wield against himself in silence. The priesthood required men to surrender their personal selves before touching sacred ground. But for those born into the royal family, the expectations reached deeper. While temple initiates were stripped of identity through ritual, princes were shaped from birth to serve one purpose. That purpose was not governance or warfare. It was a reproduction, not with whomever they desired, but with women who shared their blood. Among the highest mandates within the royal household was the continuation of divine lineage. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler, he was the living embodiment of the gods, and because the gods were thought to marry their siblings, so too were royal heirs expected to look inward when seeking a mate. A sister, a half-sister, an aunt, a cousin born of the same sacred branch. These were not accidental unions. They were deliberate, orchestrated, and reinforced through law, myth, and architecture. Marriage between siblings in the royal family did not carry shame. It carried prestige. The closer the blood, the purer the line. To produce a child with a sister was considered the highest act of devotion to the divine order. These children were not seen as biological risks. They were seen as manifestations of perfection. Carved relief showed them seated beside their parents, tiny crowns resting on their heads. Inscriptions praised their eyes, their posture, their breath. They were not infants. They were symbols. The pressure to produce such a child often fell hardest on the firstborn male heir. From an early age, he was paired with one or more of his sisters. Their education included shared lessons, shared meals, and eventually shared quarters. The pairing was planned before either had reached maturity. Servants were instructed to monitor their interactions. Priests offered blessings the moment signs of affection appeared. Their first union was scheduled as part of a larger ritual, complete with offerings and chants. What makes this practice especially difficult to unpack is the sense of normalcy it carried within the royal court. The concept of incest, as understood today, simply did not apply. There were no taboos, no warnings, no hesitations. The sisters were prepared for their role just as the brothers were. It was not a question of preference, it was destiny. Compared to modern monarchies, where alliances are often built across families and regions, the Egyptian court turned inward, trusting no one outside the bloodline. Marriage to a foreign queen brought risk. Marriage to a commoner diluted the divine. The answer, repeated across generations, was to keep the circle closed. Of course, not every child born of these unions was healthy. The genetic consequences of repeated inbreeding began to manifest over time. Some royal offspring were born with visible deformities. Others died before reaching their first year. There were cases of clubbed feet, fused toes, elongated skulls, and cognitive impairments. But even these children were honoured in death. Their small tombs were inscribed with the same reverence given to adult kings. In one notable case, a child who lived only a few weeks was mummified, wrapped in linen, and buried with a golden amulet placed over his heart. The deaths were not seen as failures. They were seen as mysteries. The gods, it was said, gave and took as they pleased. If a child died, it was because his soul was needed elsewhere. If he survived with deformities, it was because his body had been shaped for a special purpose. The priests never blamed the pairing. They blamed omens, alignment of stars, or forgotten offences in a past life. Within this framework, women carried a different kind of burden. A sister who failed to conceive was seen as lacking divine favour. A sister who gave birth to a stillborn was seen as being tested by the gods. Some were sent away from the palace. Others remained, silent and watched, while a younger sibling was elevated in their place. The hierarchy among sisters was fluid, shifting with each month and each pregnancy. The pharaoh himself was rarely given a choice. His father's advisors arranged the match. His mother often endorsed it. The Queen Mother held enormous influence in these decisions. Having once been the chosen sister herself, she understood what was expected. She ensured the pattern continued. To deviate would invite doubt, and doubt in the palace was poison. There are records of pharaohs who took multiple sisters as wives, not out of affection, but to increase the chance of producing a healthy heir. These marriages were not romantic, they were mathematical. If one sister failed, another might succeed. The women lived in adjacent quarters, their cycles were tracked, their diets are monitored, their dreams are recorded. The first sign of pregnancy was treated like a victory in battle. The children born of these unions grew up with a strange double status. They were adored, pampered, and praised, but they were also isolated. No playmates from outside the royal bloodline, no contact with the city beyond the palace walls. Their world was built of marble, linen, and silence. Every gesture they made was interpreted. Every word they spoke was recorded. They belonged not to their parents, but to the gods. What unsettles me most is how devotion to bloodline overrode even the instinct to protect one's child. The system continued even as it failed, even as the signs of decline became clearer. The architecture of power was so rigid that it could not bend, only break. And when it did break, the damage was often invisible. A king might rise with a hidden illness, a queen might miscarry in secret, a child might be buried without a name, but the practice continued. Not because it worked, but because it was believed to be sacred. Belief, in ancient Egypt, was more powerful than evidence. In rare cases, a pharaoh attempted to marry outside the family. These attempts were met with resistance. The priesthood warned of divine wrath. The advisors whispered of political instability. The marriage might proceed, but the child born of it would never be seen as equal. The blood was too thin, the gods are too far, and so the circle closed again. Brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, cousins whose names mirrored each other. They gathered in torchlit halls, reciting prayers written long before their births, touching each other not with passion, but with expectation. But even within this closed world, there were moments when love crept in where it was not supposed to, when a prince looked not at his sister, but at a servant girl, and when he did, the consequences were swift, harsh, and hidden behind doors no one dared open. The sons born of sacred incest were raised with great care, watched constantly for signs of divine inheritance, but even birth into the royal bloodline was not enough. Before a pharaoh could take the throne, he had to pass through a series of spiritual tests. Some were visible, such as coronation rites and public offerings. Others took place in private chambers where symbols carried more weight than speech. Among the most mysterious of these was the ritual of gender inversion. To connect with the goddess Isis, some pharaohs were required to become her in form. The belief stemmed from the idea that true divine power required balance. Isis was the embodiment of femininity, magic, and life. Osiris, her brother and consort, represented death, order, and renewal. A pharaoh who ruled only as Osiris was considered incomplete. To fully claim the throne, he had to demonstrate that he could channel Isis as well, not by prayer alone, but by imitation, by transformation. The ritual was known within certain priestly circles as the unification of opposites. It involved more than adopting a symbolic posture. The pharaoh was dressed in full female attire, chosen specifically to mirror the depictions of Isis carved into temple walls. He wore a linen dress, embroidered with patterns of stars and lotus flowers. His chest was padded to create a feminine shape. His arms were adorned with bangles. His feet were painted red, a colour associated with sacred femininity. His face was painted in soft tones. Kohl outlined his eyes, and his lips were darkened with crushed carmine. A wig was fitted over his shaved head, its black strands oiled and perfumed. The transformation was not intended to mock or entertain. It was meant to erase the boundary between masculine and feminine, to allow the spirit of Isis to enter and dwell within the king's body. What makes this ritual so disorienting is the quiet precision with which it was carried out, as if divinity required costume and performance rather than lineage alone. The pharaoh, for a brief moment, became a vessel not of himself, but of the goddess he claimed to honour. His own identity was paused, compared to modern expressions of gender exploration, which are often personal and voluntary. This act was mandated by spiritual duty and enforced by a religious hierarchy. A king who refused the ritual was seen as unstable, too rigid, too incomplete to balance the throne. The crown required softness as well as strength. A failure to embody both was considered dangerous. Once dressed, the pharaoh was led into a darkened chamber. There, he was not alone. A male priest, also dressed in ceremonial attire, waited. But this priest did not serve as the dominant partner. He played the role of Osiris. The pharaoh, now in the role of Isis, was instructed to perform a symbolic union. The act did not always involve contact. Sometimes it was danced. Sometimes it was mimed with a series of choreographed movements. But in a few records, the union is described more directly, with physical touch, breath shared, and posture intertwined. The room was silent. A single drum beat guided the rhythm. The floor was covered in white cloth. Incense filled the air. The moment of union was marked by the lighting of a lamp, its flame rising quickly, then steadying. Once the ritual ended, the pharaoh stood alone while attendants removed each part of the costume piece by piece, as if peeling back the goddess to reveal the god beneath. He emerged changed, not in appearance, but in status. Now he had touched both sides of creation. He had ruled as Osiris and submitted as Isis. Only then could he sit on the throne and be recognized by the full temple order. This ritual, though hidden from the public, was considered one of the final tests of readiness. Without it, The balance of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, could not be maintained. Some pharaohs embraced the role, others hesitated. Records suggest that one young king wept during the preparation. Another refused to be painted and was forced to kneel before the high priest in apology. His coronation was delayed until he agreed. These details were not recorded as a scandal. They were viewed as signs that the gods were still deciding. The garments used in this ritual were not reused. After the ceremony, they were burned or buried within the temple walls. Their purpose had been fulfilled. The pharaoh's body was then bathed in a mixture of milk and crushed pomegranate, a blend said to purify the soul and seal the transformation. No food was taken for the next 12 hours. The king fasted, not to show humility, but to prevent the earthly body from overwhelming the divine energy still present. The ritual was never spoken of publicly, not even the queen was told. The high priest guarded the memory. The scribes who documented the act did so using coded symbols: a circle resting on a square, a lotus wrapped in a cobra, a man holding two mirrors. These images appear in temple scrolls with no explanation, but those within the priesthood understood. What fascinates me is how the identity of a ruler could be dissolved and rebuilt not through war or politics, but through fabric, colour, and silence. The ritual did not diminish the pharaoh's authority, it completed it. By playing both roles, he proved that he did not belong to himself. He belonged to the divine pattern. There is no modern equivalent to this. In today's world, rulers are expected to show certainty, dominance, and control. But the Egyptian system asked for surrender, for ambiguity, for the ability to dissolve and reform without resistance. The throne was not a place for clarity, it was a place for balance. The memory of the ritual faded with time. Later dynasties simplified the coronation process. The costumes disappeared, the symbolic unions were reduced to prayers. But within the deep vaults of older temples, traces remain. Carvings of male figures and gowns. Paintings of pharaohs with both masculine and feminine markings. Eyes outlined not in dominance, but in softness. And just beyond the painted walls, another tradition held firm, one that cared less for symbolism and more for blood. A ritual that took place not in silk-lined chambers, but in underground crypts, where the only light came from oil and the only sound came from lips pressed shut. After the ritual of gender inversion affirmed the pharaoh's balance between strength and submission, there remained one final realm to confront before full sacred authority could be claimed. That realm was death. Not the symbolic death of transformational ritual fasting, but the literal death of ancestors and the looming certainty of one's mortality. For the ancient Egyptians, ruling over the living was never complete without first seeking connection with the dead. And to do that, the pharaoh had to descend, not in metaphor, in flesh. There existed a rite known only to a select few within the priesthood. It did not appear in public scrolls or temple murals. It was conducted underground, in a sealed space carved from stone, surrounded by images of jackals, serpents, and winged figures bearing knives. This ritual was called the Descent of the Breath, and at its centre was a sexual act carried out not in a palace chamber, but in a tomb. The pharaoh, accompanied by 2 or 3 high priests, would be led into a newly consecrated burial chamber late at night. No torches were used, only small oil lamps, their flames low and flickering. The tomb was not his own. It belonged to a former ruler, sometimes a father, sometimes a symbolic ancestor selected by the temple. The air inside was heavy with dust, minerals, and the sharp scent of old incense. Waiting in the chamber was a woman, already positioned near the centre of the stone floor. She wore no clothing. Her body had been prepared earlier that day with oils and herbs designed to slow her breathing and dull her senses. She had fasted, bathed, and remained in silence. Her eyes were lined with charcoal. Her lips bore the colour of ochre. Around her neck hung a single amulet carved in the shape of a scarab. She was not a concubine or a priestess in the traditional sense. Her role was specific to this ritual. She had been selected for her ability to remain still, to control her voice, to weep without sound. She was the human echo in a chamber full of stone. The act itself began with a chant, not loud, not spoken in rhythm. A single phrase repeated 3 times, then silence. The pharaoh lowered himself to the ground. His skin had been painted with ash and crushed malachite. He did not wear his crown. He did not speak. He touched the woman's shoulders, then her chest, then her stomach. Each touch corresponded to a specific line from the Book of Hidden Breath, a text known only to temple archivists. Then came the joining, not rushed, not theatrical. The purpose was not climax. It was sound. The priest believed that the human body, when placed in a tomb and brought to physical motion, produced vibrations that could awaken sleeping spirits. The moans, the breaths, the shifting of flesh against stone. All of it was thought to call out across the threshold of death. The ancestors, upon hearing it, would gather, they would listen, and if pleased, they would speak. What sets this ritual apart from other funerary customs is its raw insistence that the living must physically disturb the silence of death in order to be heard. The pharaoh did not command with incense or offerings. He commanded with his body, his breath, his presence in a space meant for stillness. Compared to modern ideas of spiritual communion, where connection with the dead is sought through prayer or meditation, this act was urgent, embodied, and deeply literal. The tomb was not a place to remember the dead. It was a place to invite them. The ritual lasted until the lamps began to flicker. At no point was the act rushed. If the pharaoh tired, the priests waited. If the woman cried, the sound was welcomed. After the final movement, the pharaoh placed both hands on the stone floor, pressing his palms flat as if to receive something. Then he rose. The woman remained. She was not touched again. She was later taken to a separate chamber where she was washed and allowed to sleep. Some women returned to temple service. Others were sent to distant estates as a form of silent reward. Their names were not recorded. Their presence in the ritual was known only to the few who watched. There are tombs with inscriptions that hint at this ceremony. One reads, "He who called beneath the stone was heard." Another describes the rising of dust with breath. A third, found near the Valley of the Kings, shows a figure lying with another beneath a hovering eye, surrounded by glyphs for silence and eternity. The ritual was not repeated often. It was reserved for transitions of power, moments of uncertainty, or omens that suggested a loss of favour from the ancestors. It was always initiated by the priests, never by the king. To ask for the rite was considered arrogance. To be chosen for it was considered a burden and a privilege alike. What fascinates me is how this ceremony reframes sexuality not as pleasure or reproduction, but as sound offered into darkness. The act became a form of language, a calling out into stone, into memory, into the silence that rules beneath every throne. There were risks. A priest could faint from the heat. The pharaoh might suffer from dizziness due to the lack of air. In one recorded case, a woman collapsed and could not be revived. Her body was buried in the same tomb where the rite had taken place, wrapped in linens marked with the symbol for passage. After the ritual, the pharaoh fasted for 2 days. He did not speak to his advisors. He slept alone. It was believed that in the hours following the descent, the soul was still open, vulnerable to messages from beyond. During this time, he might dream of former rulers, he might see visions of the afterlife, or he might see nothing. The silence itself was interpreted. The tomb used for the ritual was sealed afterward. No one returned. The dust was left undisturbed. The tools were not cleaned. The memory of the rite lived only in the breath that had echoed within its walls, and above that sealed chamber, the court returned to its daily rhythm. Servants lit lamps, dancers rehearsed, scribes recorded royal decrees, but somewhere, deep beneath, a voice had been released. Whether it had been heard or not, no one could say. Elsewhere in the temple grounds, another practice waited, not beneath the ground, but high within the sacred towers. There, a different kind of union was being prepared, one where power was not spoken, but exchanged without words, and the offering came not from the king, but from those who sought to rule beside him. In the sacred tombs where the pharaoh called to his ancestors with breath and flesh, the power of the dead was invoked, but above ground, in the living world of temples and courts, another kind of power had to be secured. It did not rise from the spirits of old kings, but from the hands and bodies of the priesthood. Among the many whispered paths to the throne, there was one route rarely acknowledged, never recorded publicly, and always understood in silence. It involved no coronation ceremony, no scroll, no decree. It involved submission, and it was the price some young pharaohs were expected to pay. Within the upper ranks of the temple, hierarchy lived priests who did not simply interpret omens or manage offerings. They were gatekeepers. Their approval was necessary for the rituals that crowned a king, blessed a war, or named a child divine. They spoke in riddles, carried staffs carved with forgotten symbols, and lived lives marked by isolation and control. Their authority could not be challenged. Their influence could not be ignored. When a pharaoh ascended the throne as a mature man, trained and seasoned, the temple confirmed his right through public rites. But when the heir was young, uncertain, or politically weak, the process changed. A private ritual was introduced, not discussed openly, not written in the coronation records. It was known among senior clergy and certain court advisors. It was called the passing of presence. The ceremony, if it can be called that, took place in a sacred room beneath the inner temple. It was lit by a single oil lamp, placed on a high shelf, casting long shadows on the wall. The young pharaoh, newly anointed but not yet confirmed, was brought in under the cover of night. He had been told to fast, to remain silent, and to prepare himself to receive guidance. Waiting in the room was a senior priest, older, always male, and considered by the temple to be a vessel of accumulated divine energy. His role was not ceremonial, it was physical. Through an act of intimacy, it was believed that spiritual authority could be transferred. The king would receive not just instruction, but power, not just approval, but inheritance. What makes this ritual deeply unsettling is the complete inversion of the public royal image. In every visible context, the pharaoh ruled. In this room, he submitted. He did not speak. He did not command. He lay down and waited. The priest approached without hesitation. The act was carried out slowly, without cruelty, but without tenderness. It was not intended to please. It was intended to complete a cycle. Compared to modern systems of political succession, which emphasize birthright and legality, this ancient belief introduced physical dependence as a condition of authority. The king's legitimacy was not born in a bloodline alone. It had to be activated by touch. And that touch came from someone older, someone spiritually anchored, someone above earthly rank. There were no scribes in the room, no observers, only the two participants and the lamp. When the act ended, the priest placed his hand on the pharaoh's chest and whispered a line from a temple hymn. The flame was extinguished. The king rose, dressed again in silence, and was led to the next stage of his public initiation. The ritual was not repeated. It was a one-time act, a transfer. Afterward, the priest returned to seclusion. He did not boast. He did not appear in court, but his name might be mentioned later in royal prayers. His influence would linger in quiet decisions, in dreams described to the High Council, in moments when the young king hesitated before speaking. For those within the temple, the ritual was not abuse. It was a function. The human body was a vessel. The spirit, like oil, had to be poured. And just as oil required a container, power required flesh. The king received, the priest released. Balance was maintained. But outside that chamber, the whispers began. Servants caught fragments of conversation. Advisors noticed which priests were elevated afterward. Some queens grew suspicious when their sons returned from temple grounds quieter than before. But no one spoke openly. To question the ritual was to question the foundation of sacred rule. What troubles me most is the way silence became a form of participation. Everyone knew. No one admitted. The truth hovered around every coronation like the scent of incense that never fully faded, and those who had gone through the rite recognized it in each other. A certain glance, a certain stillness, a shared awareness that something had been given away to gain what could never be taken by force. There are no texts that describe this ritual directly, but certain temple walls contain symbols that, when arranged, suggest the act. A young falcon resting below a lion, a hand reaching behind a throne, a reed bent over a bowl. These symbols were never explained in full. Only those who had lived the ritual understood their meaning. Over time, the practice faded. As dynasties shifted and new theological ideas emerged, the role of the high priest changed. But in the oldest temples, in the scrolls locked away behind false walls, references remain. They speak of a joining, a touch that opens the path, a moment of quiet binding. For the kings who underwent it, the memory may have been buried beneath layers of ritual, war, and public adoration, but it never vanished. In their private moments, in dreams, or in the way their hands lingered over certain temple inscriptions, the ritual remained, a shape in the dark, a cost never spoken, only felt, and in a different wing of the palace, other rites unfolded that were far more visible. In brightly lit halls with polished floors, women waited not to confirm kingship, but to demonstrate fertility. Their bodies were not vessels of transmission, but of performance. And in one carefully guarded structure near the edge of the inner court, a new kind of ritual had begun, one where pleasure and prophecy met beneath painted ceilings. Not every sacred act happened in public view. While some rituals demanded witnesses, declarations, and the presence of the court, others thrived in silence. After the private rites passed between priests and pharaohs, another kind of space began to emerge across certain temples. These were not rooms for prayer or places for sacrifice. They were built for one single purpose: to host moments of flesh and spirit, hidden from all eyes except the gods themselves. Some of these structures were never listed in public temple records. Others were described vaguely as halls of harmony or chambers of divine joy. Their true function was passed down only among the chosen few, and it began with architecture. Unlike the grand sanctuaries with towering columns and sunlit altars, these hidden chambers were smaller, more intimate, and completely sealed from outside view. The entrance was disguised behind layers of stone passageways. Some were accessible only through vertical shafts, others behind concealed doors that blended into the temple walls. These were not built for processions, they were built for secrecy. Inside, the design shifted drastically. Gone were the harsh floors and echoing ceilings of ceremonial halls. Instead, the rooms were warm and softly lit. The floors were made of polished black stone, smooth enough that bare skin could slide across it with little resistance. Along one side, a shallow pool had been carved into the ground, constantly filled with warm water infused with local herbs. The walls were painted with stars and lotuses, not gods or wars. Scented oil burners were built directly into the walls, maintaining a subtle fragrance of myrrh and acacia throughout the night. The purpose of these chambers was not rest. It was a ritual. In many cases, the participants were selected days in advance. A pharaoh might enter the chamber alone or with a chosen woman from the temple ranks. She might be a priestess, a servant, or a dancer trained in a specific sequence of movements. Before entering, she would be bathed, perfumed and dressed in nothing but translucent linen. She would speak no words unless asked. Her role was not to seduce, but to embody. The act itself was called by many names. Among them, the most common was the divine blending. It was believed that in this protected space, the physical union of the pharaoh and his partner allowed the gods to influence the future. The movements were slow, deliberate, and choreographed according to older instructions passed down by temple elders. Each action corresponded to a celestial body. Each touch mirrored a line from a sacred hymn. The moment of climax was seen as a fusion, not only of two bodies, but of heaven and earth. The strange part was not the act itself, but the extent to which architecture, scent, temperature, and silence were arranged to serve it. The room became a vessel, the body became a tool, and desire, usually viewed as base or instinctive, was elevated into something holy. The pharaoh was expected not only to perform, but to be transformed during the act. In modern terms, this was not a bedroom. It was a sacred performance space built around intimacy. The difference between comfort and ceremony was erased. There was no bed, there were no sheets, only the pool, the stone, and the oils. The body had to adapt, the mind had to empty. The ritual had to flow without hesitation. The temple officials who maintained these rooms were specially trained. They were not guards, but keepers of purity. They cleaned the floors with vinegar and rose water after each use. They refilled the oil lamps. They replaced the herbs in the water basin. But they never stayed during the act. The chamber was sacred not because of who entered, but because of who was excluded. Only a small number of temples were known to have such rooms. Most were attached to major cults, like those of Hathor, Isis, or Amun. The rooms were often near the rear of the temple, closest to the innermost sanctum. In some cases, they shared a wall with the statue of the god, separated by a thin veil of stone or wood. This was intentional. The belief was that the sounds, the heat, and the energy of the ritual would pass through and awaken the god. Over time, these chambers gained a reputation. Some were said to bestow fertility on any couple who used them. Others were believed to cure impotence or despair. A few were rumoured to house hidden inscriptions that only revealed themselves in candlelight after the act was complete. But all of them shared one rule. No one without temple authority could enter. Violation of this rule was punishable not by public trial, but by spiritual exile. The person would be banned from temple grounds, denied burial rites, and cut off from the gods forever. For pharaohs, these chambers offered something rare. A place to be vulnerable without consequence. A place where divine roles could be explored, even reversed. Some kings chose to lie still and let the priestess perform every motion. Others preferred to lead, reciting sacred lines while touching certain points on the body in sequence. Regardless of style, the goal was not pleasure, it was alignment. The body had to mirror the stars, the soul had to open. What strikes me is how much trust was placed in stone and silence. These rooms did not speak, but they remembered. Each footstep left a trace of oil. Each breath changed the air. Over time, the stones absorbed more memory than the scrolls, and yet no records exist describing the rituals in detail. Everything was felt. Nothing was written. Occasionally, fragments of this practice appear in later texts. A line in a temple hymn speaks of the harmony of two lights touching in darkness. A symbol etched into a pool's edge resembles the joined hands of a god and mortal. These hints survive not as evidence but as echoes, enough to suggest, never enough to confirm. In some rare cases, travellers or foreign scribes wrote of rumours surrounding the pharaoh's hidden rooms. They were dismissed as fantasy, or worse, heresy. But the consistency of these whispers across centuries suggests something deeper. These were not isolated rumours, they were memories, preserved by those who dared to speak them aloud. Eventually, as new religions took hold and temples were abandoned, Many of these chambers were sealed. Some were filled with sand to prevent entry. Others were hidden beneath renovations. A few may still exist, untouched beneath ruined walls, holding the scent of oil and the echo of breath, waiting for someone to understand what they were meant to hold. And while these chambers explored the union of body and divine in private, a different tradition was unfolding in the heart of the palace. This time, it was not the king or the priestess at the centre. It was a queen, and she held something even more dangerous than desire. She held the blood that bound gods to rulers. The hidden chambers may have faded into silence, but their spirit did not vanish. It simply moved. When the living body was no longer present to perform the rites, the Egyptians found another vessel, one that could travel into the next world, one that could hold images, memory, and desire at once. That vessel was the coffin, and it did far more than protect the remains of the dead. It became a canvas for their pleasures, their fantasies, and the rituals they believed would carry them into eternity. While many sarcophagi were adorned with traditional symbols of protection, like the winged goddess Nut or rows of hieroglyphic prayers, a smaller number told a different story. They did not just show gods and offerings, they showed bodies, tangled, exposed, merging. These scenes were not always easy to recognize at first glance. Some were tucked beneath the lid, others were etched into the base, only visible once the coffin was opened, but the detail was unmistakable. One example uncovered in the late period depicted a naked woman reclining on a bed of lotuses. A man, shown with the royal beard, leaned over her from behind. Their bodies were connected in a way that left little room for interpretation. Above them, symbols of rebirth floated alongside stars. At first, some scholars thought this might be symbolic of the union between Osiris and Isis, but the woman bore no divine markings. Instead, she wore the jewellery of a noble, and her face resembled portraits found on nearby papyri. She was not a goddess, she was a person, and this was her coffin. It is one thing to believe in a paradise. It is another thing to plan your entry into it through illustrated sex scenes. For the Egyptians, pleasure was not something to be left behind at death. It was something to be preserved, even intensified. The afterlife was not a void, it was a continuation. So they filled their tombs with food, tools, and sometimes erotic guidance. If modern people commission photo shoots for weddings, these women commissioned erotic murals for eternity. The purpose was not shameful, it was sacred. The act of coupling was believed to awaken the soul, to keep it warm, active, and able to cross the thresholds between realms. In a cold tomb surrounded by silence, these images served as both memory and invitation. The artists chosen to create these scenes were not ordinary painters. They were part of a select group trained in the anatomy of both humans and gods. Before they began work, they underwent purification rituals. They fasted. They bathed in river water before sunrise, and most notably, they painted nude. This was not for comfort or rebellion. It was a rule. The idea was that the artist had to feel the vulnerability and exposure of the subject. Only then could they transmit the proper energy through the brush. They worked in near darkness, using oil lamps with blue or red glass covers to set the right hue. The outlines were first sketched with charcoal made from burnt myrrh, then natural pigments from ochre, indigo, and hematite were applied with delicate reeds. The emphasis was always on curves, hands, and the joining of hips. Faces were softened, lips slightly parted, eyes half closed. It was not a depiction of lust. It was a map for the spirit to follow. These paintings were typically found on the inside of the sarcophagus lid, or along the side panels near the pelvis. The logic was practical. When the soul rose from the body, it would open its eyes and see the guidance first. The position of the imagery mattered, just like the placement of amulets or the wrapping of bandages. Every detail followed a coded instruction. There were other reasons these scenes were kept inside the coffin. On the outer shell, tradition had to be followed. Visitors, priests, and family would see the coffin during funerals. It had to appear appropriate, respectful, divine. But once sealed, the coffin no longer belonged to the living. It belonged to the dead, and the dead had their own desires. Some families were aware of this practice and approved it. Others pretended not to notice. In certain cases, female nobles were known to request these illustrations in secret, using trusted temple scribes to arrange the work. Payment was made discreetly, often in the form of oil, linen, or even sexual favours. These commissions were never written into wills. They were whispered agreements, passed along with folded pieces of papyrus and short nods behind incense smoke. What makes these scenes even more striking is the emotional tone. There is no violence, no shame, no grotesque exaggeration. The figures appear calm, sensual, connected. The settings are lush, with beds of flowers, bowls of fruit, and flowing drapery. Sometimes animals, like doves or cats, are painted nearby as symbols of fertility and warmth. The goal was not to shock, it was to soothe. What I find remarkable is the belief that sensuality could anchor a soul, like a compass in the underworld. When the spirit drifted through shadowy corridors in search of its place, it would remember the feeling of warmth, the softness of skin, the closeness of another body. The illustration would remind them that pleasure was not a thing of the past. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled again. Some tombs even included smaller stone tablets with similar images, placed near the feet or genitals of the mummy. These were sometimes referred to as heat tokens or passion markers. They were not signed. They bore no text, just a carving of two people joining, usually with one hand resting on the other's chest. It was enough. Over time, as foreign rulers took over Egypt and religious views changed, these erotic depictions were either erased or buried deeper within the tombs. Later, archaeologists sometimes misinterpreted them as decoration, or dismissed them as fantasies added by later looters. But with more research, the pattern became clear. These were intentional, ritualistic, and deeply personal. Today, only a handful of these erotic coffins remain intact. Some are kept in museum storage, away from public display. Others have been damaged or faded, but in the dim corners of archives, sketches and photos show what was once there, and through them, we catch a glimpse of a world where love and lust were not opposites, but allies in the journey of the soul, from murals inside a coffin to another ancient practice that was far more visible to the public. The next chapter of pharaonic sexuality unfolded on a different stage. This time, it involved young men, royal lineage, and a ritual that still confuses historians to this day. When the carvings on coffins were not enough, and the painted scenes began to fade in the dark, some Egyptian women chose a more intimate form of preparation for the afterlife. They did not rely on images or symbols placed around them. They carried the ritual within themselves, quite literally. Among the most unexpected archaeological discoveries in recent years was a group of female mummies found with small objects hidden inside their bodies, not in their hands or mouths as was customary, but placed deep within the vaginal cavity. These were not random fragments. They were carefully shaped, deliberately inserted, and clearly symbolic. They were, by all accounts, sexual amulets. These talismans were small, most measured no more than a few centimetres, just enough to be slipped inside without injuring the embalmed tissue. They were made from a range of materials, including limestone, soapstone, hematite, and even glazed ceramic. Each bore a distinctive shape. Some resembled erect penises with detailed ridges and flared tips. Others were abstract, shaped like tongues of flame or seeds bursting open. None were labelled, none were recorded in official funerary texts, but their placement made the intention unmistakable. It is one thing to wear a necklace for love, but another to die with a phallic charm hidden inside you. For these women, the afterlife was not only about purity, balance, or judgment. It was also about readiness. sexual readiness. They believed that when their souls awakened, they needed to be in a state of openness. Receptivity was not shameful. It was sacred. Many Egyptologists were puzzled when the first such amulet was discovered. At first, some thought it was a mistake, perhaps a misplaced tool from the embalmers, but the object was positioned too precisely. It was not near the vaginal entrance or lodged loosely. It was embedded with purpose, nestled near the cervix, facing upward. Later discoveries confirmed the pattern. Multiple female mummies from different dynasties and regions shared this same internal feature. There were no matching practices found in male mummies. No talismans were placed in their anuses or urethras. This ritual seemed specific to female bodies, and more specifically, to women of elite or priestly status. Some had elaborate jewellery and richly adorned wrappings. Others had simpler coffins but carefully arranged offerings nearby. But all shared the same hidden charm within. In a modern context, this might be seen as invasive or even scandalous, but in ancient Egypt, it was considered a way to preserve the feminine principle in its most powerful form. Sexuality was not reduced to pleasure. It was a force, a conduit, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Some scholars believe these vaginal amulets were connected to the myth of Isis and Osiris. After Osiris was murdered and dismembered, Isis reassembled his body and restored his manhood. She then conceived their son Horus through an act of magical intimacy. In this myth, the ability to receive divine seed was essential. It was a form of resurrection. So for women in death, carrying a symbolic phallus could be interpreted as a preparation for their spiritual rebirth. There are hints in temple inscriptions that support this theory. One text describes the goddess Hathor whispering into the ear of a dead queen, saying her womb must remain warm and open even in stillness. Another speaks of the burning gate, a term believed to refer to the vaginal canal, kept alight by magic to lure divine attention. Though vague, these phrases hint at a theological framework in which the female body remained active even after death. The choice of shape also matters. The phallic charms were not crude. They were smooth, often polished, and occasionally painted with faint traces of red ochre, symbolizing vitality. Those shaped like flames or petals may have been intended to symbolize the moment of arousal, the cusp between form and energy. They were not meant to represent literal acts, but symbolic readiness. The embalmers who placed these charms likely did so in secrecy. The act was not listed among the standard steps of mummification. It was perhaps carried out at night, in the final hours before sealing the coffin. The charm would be wrapped in a thin layer of linen soaked in resin, then gently inserted using a tool or by hand. The linen acted as both a casing and a spiritual purifier. These amulets were not discussed in funerary manuals or depicted on tomb walls. They were personal, a final private choice made by the deceased or her closest attendants. In some cases, the charm was accompanied by a folded piece of papyrus tucked under the pelvis, containing symbols or short invocations, but most were left unmarked, left to speak only through form. What I find most haunting is the idea that someone, in full knowledge of death, asked to be buried with a symbol of desire still glowing inside her. She did not want to be remembered only for her lineage or titles. She wanted her final act to be one of sensual anticipation. The presence of these charms has sparked controversy in modern scholarship. Some museums refuse to display them. Others hide them in storage, labelling them vaguely as ritual items. But the truth remains clear. These were not random. They were a message, a declaration, a whisper from the dead that the body, even in decay, held meaning far beyond function. There is no indication that these charms were considered immoral or profane. The opposite may be true. Their secrecy did not come from shame, but from sacredness. Like many of Egypt's most powerful rites, they were hidden not to conceal sin, but to protect mystery. Today, forensic imaging has allowed researchers to detect such amulets without disturbing the wrappings. In one case, A woman buried near Thebes was found with not one but 3 charms inside her body, arranged in a triangle. No explanation was given, but the symbolism remains open to wonder. As we move forward through these strange and intimate practices, the next one reveals how far the obsession with sexual power could go. It was not enough to preserve desire. For some, the body of the pharaoh himself had to become the object of sacred attention, even after death. There were ceremonies so private they left no inscriptions. Others were so shocking that they were only whispered about in the corridors of broken temples. But the ritual known as the awakening of the fire god managed to exist in both shadows and memory. It was one of the rarest events in the sacred calendar, not celebrated annually, not even once in a generation. It was only performed when a great silence fell over the temple's inner sanctum, when a statue lost its warmth, when the stone was no longer alive. That was when the priest declared that the fire god had gone to sleep, and he needed to be awakened with ecstasy. The preparations for this ceremony were slow and deliberate. It began with isolation. The chosen participants were kept apart for 3 days. No talking, no touching. They were fed honeyed dates and bitter herbs to cleanse the body. Water infused with blue lotus was poured over their heads in the morning. No one told them what would happen. Only the high priest and a handful of temple scribes knew the full sequence. For most, their bodies would speak before their minds understood. At sunset on the 4th day, the initiates were brought to the sanctum. They entered single file, eyes down, feet bare. Their garments were removed one by one. Each layer was taken as a layer of the self, a surrender. By the time they reached the inner chamber, no cloth remained. The floor was covered in smooth black stone, warmed from below by hidden channels of fire. In the centre stood a massive statue carved from meteoric iron. It was said to contain the essence of a fallen star, cold to the touch, always asleep. The goal of the ceremony was simple in theory. Pleasure would awaken the divine, but the execution was anything but simple. Participants were instructed to lie down on the warm stone floor and begin touching each other, not with violence, not with urgency, but with a rhythm that echoed the breath of creation. Moans, sighs, and the scent of sweat would fill the air. They were told not to look at the statue. It would see them only through feeling. As arousal grew, the priest circled the room, whispering chants and sprinkling crushed cinnamon and resin onto the fire ducts. Imagine being asked to lie naked in a temple, surrounded by strangers, all expected to climax as an offering to a god made of rock. That was the burden of the chosen. But it was also their honour. The orgy was not chaotic. It had rules. Participants had to rotate partners every time the flame beneath the statue shifted colour. The goal was not individual release, but collective transcendence. It was said that when enough bodies achieved simultaneous pleasure, the god would stir. A pulse would be felt through the floor, a faint hum in the air. If it happened, the statue's eyes would glow faintly red. That was the sign of success. There were scribes positioned in alcoves above the chamber, unseen but ever watchful. They did not participate. Their job was to observe and record the number of rotations, the pace of moaning, and the order in which bodies collapsed from exhaustion. Every detail mattered. This was not indulgence. It was sacred calculus. If modern psychologists could peek into this ritual, they would need years of therapy afterward just to explain what they saw. But in ancient Egypt, this was simply another tool to balance the unseen forces of the world. Some participants were too weak to complete the ceremony. When that happened, they were gently pulled to the side and allowed to lie near the sacred tombs lining the rear of the chamber. These were not punishment zones. They were places of rest. It was believed that those who fainted from divine ecstasy were spiritually closer to the ancestors. Their reward was to sleep beside the dead, where dreams would carry them directly to the fire god's realm. No records mention children being conceived from this ritual. That was not its purpose. Fertility was only a byproduct. The true goal was to create enough heat, enough trembling, enough sound to shake the stone god from his slumber. Whether this ever actually worked was never proven, but the ritual survived across several dynasties, even as other ceremonies faded. The number of participants varied. Some ceremonies included only a dozen, others had close to 100. All were chosen based on astrological signs, bloodline, and sensitivity to perfumes. It was believed that those who responded quickly to scent were more attuned to spiritual vibration. There were risks. Fainting was common. Some suffered burns from the heated floor, a few dislocated joints or torn ligaments in the frenzy. But no one was allowed to stop until the priest declared the ritual complete. Once done, the floor was washed with rose water and salt. Participants were wrapped in white linen, given lotus wine, and led outside before sunrise. They were forbidden to speak of what they had seen or felt for 3 moons. Some historians speculate that the entire ritual was less about awakening a statue and more about maintaining loyalty, a way for the priesthood to bind people together in shared vulnerability. Others argue it was a way to purge negative energy from the community, casting it into the statue as a vessel. But for those who experienced it, there was no doubt. Something shifted, whether god or flesh. Something stirred in the fire and stone. Something is unnerving about the idea that human intimacy could be weaponized for divine attention. It makes one wonder how far people will go when silence feels like divine abandonment. Though the ceremony fell out of favour after the late period, fragments of its ritual appeared later in Coptic mysticism and even in the erotic spells of Greco-Roman Egypt. Its legacy remains as both myth and memory. The next ritual takes that relationship between body and symbolism even further, not with group ecstasy, but with silent art, because sometimes what was not said could be carved onto wood and buried with you for eternity. There were rituals in ancient Egypt that blurred the lines between ceremony and cruelty. One of the most unsettling was the sexual sacrifice of male slaves to the royal women of the palace. This was not simply a private indulgence, nor a mere act of domination. It was a ritual with a declared divine purpose, orchestrated to fulfill a singular goal, helping the queen conceive a royal heir when the pharaoh had failed. The method was extreme, the logic twisted, and the aftermath always brutal. The process began long before the ritual itself, within the ranks of the palace slaves. Young men were occasionally pulled aside and examined. They were measured, their bodies inspected for symmetry, and their genitals evaluated for both form and supposed fertility. They were not told why. They were just led to quieter quarters, fed slightly better food, and scrubbed clean more often than their peers. This attention felt like fortune. For many, it was the last comfort they would ever know. The priest believed that if the pharaoh's seed was weak, a foreign body could act as a conduit for fertility, while keeping the queen's status intact. As long as the ritual was sanctioned by the gods, the resulting child was considered royal. But the slave involved was never meant to live long enough to see it. On the day of the ritual, the chosen slave was awakened before sunrise. His body was washed in sacred oils and dusted with powdered amber. He was given a small amount of date wine, enough to dull awareness but not to intoxicate. Then, without ceremony, he was led into a chamber beneath the main temple. There, the queen waited alone or sometimes accompanied by a priestess or elder advisor. The slave was expected to perform without question. He had no choice. His hands were often bound with silk cords, not to restrain but to symbolize surrender. Only in ancient Egypt could sexual exploitation be rebranded as a sacred state function. The queen was said to absorb the vitality of the offering through the act. It was believed that the breath, sweat, and essence of a man condemned to die held powerful energy. After the act, there was no pause for gratitude. The priest entered again, and the ritual moved to its next phase. In most cases, the slave was immediately taken to another chamber and executed. Sometimes it was by strangulation with a ceremonial cloth. Other times, by bleeding, or in rare cases, by being buried alive beneath the queen's chamber as a living sacrifice. The chosen method varied according to the priesthood's interpretation of the signs that day. What followed was perhaps even more disturbing. In some instances, the genitalia of the slave were preserved, painted with gold, and placed in small shrines as symbols of divine potency. These objects were not hidden. They were shown to guests as proof of the queen's link to fertility magic. The slave's death was not a secret. It was a required conclusion. The women of the court were told to avert their eyes if they did not wish to see. Yet many watched. Some believed the act transferred spiritual power to the queen. Others simply observed in silence, trained to suppress disgust. Modern ethics would crumble instantly under the weight of this kind of ceremony. Imagine a state-sanctioned sacrifice involving sexual contact, death, and religious justification, all written into public record. The tradition did not occur regularly. It was invoked only during crises when the pharaoh grew old and infertile, when a queen had miscarried more than once, or when political rivals questioned the legitimacy of a royal child. In these cases, the priesthood intervened, not to condemn or reform, but to supervise. They did not question the morality of the act. They only ensured its effectiveness. Some of the queens involved became infamous in temple records. One in particular was said to have performed this rite more than 3 times during her reign. It was whispered that her son, a powerful ruler in his own time, was born of such a union. The slave's name was never recorded. The psychological effects on the royal women were not discussed in official texts. There was no room for sorrow, guilt, or hesitation. The queen was the vessel of the nation's future. Her body belonged to Egypt, not to herself, and so did the lives taken for her fertility. Reading these records, I can't help but feel a strange mixture of awe and revulsion. The devotion to symbolism is breathtaking, but the human cost is impossible to ignore. The chamber where the rituals occurred has never been found intact, but fragments of ivory carvings and hieroglyphs suggest it was adorned with stars, serpents, and depictions of Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood. A disturbing irony, considering what took place there. There were moments when the ritual was interrupted. In one recorded instance, a slave managed to scream during the process. The priesthood interpreted it as a bad omen. The queen was isolated for 7 days, the chamber cleansed with vinegar and myrrh, and the body of the slave burned instead of buried. No further rituals were allowed that year. By the late New Kingdom, the practice declined. Not because of compassion, but because more queens began turning to sacred objects, incense rituals, and fertility amulets instead. The priesthood shifted its focus to spiritual energy rather than physical acts. Still, mentions of the offering of flesh appear sporadically in temple margins, always with reverence, never with shame. The fact that such a practice could exist within one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations speaks volumes about the complexity of power, gender, and belief. It reminds us that cruelty and sanctity often wore the same mask. What became of the bodies of those sacrificed is still debated. Some say they were burned and scattered. Others believe they were entombed beneath temple floors, hidden from history but never truly gone. The next ritual takes us into even more forbidden territory. It was not about the queen, nor the pharaoh, but about the royal daughters, and what was expected of them before their first moonblood could change everything. In the dim inner sanctums of ancient Egyptian temples, where few outsiders were ever allowed, there existed rituals involving objects more peculiar than most can imagine. Among them were small jars made of alabaster, lapis lazuli, or dark green serpentine. These were not perfumes or oils, as one might expect in the realm of ancient royalty. These were vessels designed specifically to hold the most intimate and biologically potent element of the pharaoh himself, his semen. The idea behind storing a pharaoh's semen in a gemstone jar might sound mythical or metaphorical, but to the priests of fertility and continuity, It was a sacred material link between the divine and the earthly. The pharaoh, believed to be the living embodiment of Horus, was not merely king but a god whose essence had to be preserved, literally. And so his sperm was carefully collected, ritually cleansed of impurity by priestesses, then sealed into jars, each of which had its ceremonial markings, incantations, and assigned role in fertility rites. The collection process was highly structured. It did not happen randomly or during illness or stress. It occurred only at specific astrologically significant times, such as eclipses, the first rains of the year, or in preparation for temple fertility festivals. The pharaoh would be taken to a chamber prepared in advance, its walls painted with depictions of sacred union and bathed in incense smoke. After the ritual collection, the semen would be mixed with tiny amounts of gold dust or frankincense ash before being sealed. These jars were then stored in the House of Life, a sacred part of the temple complex where only high-ranking clergy could enter. Some were placed beside the statue of Isis or Osiris, linking the royal essence with deities associated with rebirth, agriculture, and the afterlife. Others were stored in underground niches where temperature and moisture were controlled by natural architecture, a primitive but surprisingly effective form of preservation. Only in ancient Egypt could something as private as semen be granted the same reverence as a royal scepter. The jars were not left to gather dust. They were frequently used in fertility rites, especially when the pharaoh was aging or had no male heir. In such cases, the preserved semen was believed to retain its divine potency, and could be used in ceremonies where a surrogate or even the queen herself would symbolically receive the seed through ritual gestures. There is even some evidence, though sparse, suggesting the substance was mixed with spring water and given to virgin priestesses to drink, under the belief that it would bless their wombs and preserve the divine bloodline. To modern minds, the entire concept may feel more like a myth from a surreal novel than a real state ritual. But fragments of temple logs and illustrations on ceremonial papyrus point to such practices. Scenes of jars being placed at the feet of god statues, of priestesses chanting over vessels wrapped in gold-threaded linen, and of women bowing before altars where these jars sat, appear across several temple sites. In some tombs, these jars were even buried with a pharaoh, placed near his chest or between his feet. They were thought to provide him with potency in the afterlife. The journey beyond death was imagined as a continuation of earthly roles, and a pharaoh without reproductive power in the next world would be considered incomplete. Therefore, his own preserved essence became part of his funerary toolkit. It's not unlike modern sperm banks, except ours are kept in sterile labs while theirs were surrounded by chants, oil lamps, and statues of jackal-headed gods. There were rules, of course. Not just any moment or mood was acceptable for extraction. Priests often consulted celestial omens before scheduling the ritual. The jars themselves had to be shaped in specific ways, sometimes with pointed bottoms meant to be embedded into temple floors, anchoring the essence to sacred ground. Others were hourglass-shaped, representing the cycle of fertility and time. Occasionally, jars would be intentionally broken. This was done during offerings meant to awaken or energize the fertility of the land. The logic followed that by symbolically releasing the pharaoh's divine seed into the earth, the soil would become more productive. Ceremonies timed with Nile flooding sometimes involved pouring the jar's contents, whether real or symbolic, into the riverbanks to bless the waters. Not all priests agreed on the literal interpretation. Some considered the semen in the jar to be a metaphor, a sacred substance prepared through alchemical means to resemble royal seed. But the written records rarely draw such distinctions, and the reverence with which the jars were handled suggests the belief was not just symbolic. Over time, the practice evolved. In later dynasties, some jars began including not only semen but also hair clippings, nail fragments, and blood droplets from the pharaoh. These additions were thought to concentrate his power. There was a brief period when some jars were blessed and given as amulets to temple dancers or priestesses. a dangerous mingling of ritual and daily life that was eventually banned. Reading about these rituals, I find myself equally fascinated and disturbed. The degree to which bodily fluids were ritualized says as much about their theology as it does about their understanding of power. Even today, in museum archives across Europe and Egypt, curators occasionally discover small jars with inscriptions indicating such sacred uses. Their contents long since dried or lost, but their purpose is still evident in the markings. Some are stored in special rooms, rarely displayed to the public, not because of shame, but because few would understand what they are seeing. The pharaoh was not just a ruler of men, but a ruler of meaning. His body, his desires, and his essence were all tools of the state, directed not by whim but by religious expectations centuries in the making. And even after death, his physical remains were managed like state property. What's more astonishing is how these ideas extended beyond the pharaoh. In the next part, we'll look at how some royal daughters were trained from early childhood to participate in similar rituals, not as passive figures, but as active preservers of the divine cycle. Tucked deep inside sealed temple chambers and private archives, there existed a type of papyrus that few eyes were ever meant to see. These were not royal decrees or lists of grain offerings. These were instructional scrolls, hand-drawn in ink made from soot and wine. They depicted human bodies entangled in precise acts of intercourse. Unlike the stylized depictions found in tomb art or temple murals, these illustrations were uncomfortably realistic. Limbs curved with tension. Expressions of pleasure were deliberately captured. Positions were varied, and many scenes were accompanied by annotations describing motion, rhythm, and purpose. These scrolls were part of a body of knowledge known as ritual erotica. In the context of ancient Egyptian beliefs, sex was not merely for procreation or pleasure. It was a tool of divine alignment, a mechanism to restore cosmic balance, and sometimes a medical solution. Among couples who could not conceive, especially those of noble or priestly class, these scrolls were brought out not for entertainment, but instruction. The acts shown were believed to replicate the original unions between gods and goddesses. By mimicking them exactly, couples could supposedly unlock blocked fertility channels or realign their energies with sacred rhythms. Only high priests and priestesses were allowed to handle these scrolls. They were stored in locked wooden cabinets, usually painted black and marked with hieroglyphs that warned of desecration. The penalty for a commoner glimpsing one of these drawings was severe. Even palace guards who transported the scrolls had to keep their eyes down and their hands gloved. This secrecy was not because the scrolls were considered shameful, but because they were considered powerful. The idea was that only the spiritually prepared could endure their energy without harm. Leave it to ancient Egypt to turn porn into a sacred state-sponsored education program. Most scrolls were brought out during a ritual known as the alignment of the flame, performed on certain moonless nights. During this ceremony, barren couples were taken into a specially prepared chamber. The room was cleansed with smoke, lit with flickering oil lamps, and adorned with painted symbols of lotus, ankh, and scarab. The scrolls were then unrolled by a temple attendant and placed on a stone table. The couple would view them while receiving whispered instructions from a priestess trained in both healing and erotic technique. In some variations of the ritual, couples were expected to perform one or more of the depicted acts in the presence of the priestess. This was not voyeurism. It was a correction. Just as a healer would guide a patient through physical therapy, the priestess would observe and make gentle adjustments, a shift of the hip, a slowing of the breath. A touch relocated by inches. The belief was that improper technique could block the flow of life energy, while properly aligned bodies would invite conception as a natural consequence. These teachings extended beyond infertile couples. In temples dedicated to Hathor or Isis, selected temple dancers were also taught using these scrolls. The goal was not seduction, but resonance. Their movements were choreographed to echo the sacred unions, forming a kind of living sculpture of fertility. During certain public festivals, these dancers would perform symbolic movements drawn from the scrolls, though no one in the crowd knew the full meaning behind the gestures. What shocks modern readers is not simply the presence of erotic material, but the clinical detail. Positions were drawn from multiple angles. Notes included recommended durations, breathing patterns, and even dietary guidelines for the days leading up to ritual intercourse. Some scrolls suggested specific times of day and moon phases for each act. Others warned against excessive passion, claiming it could deplete the man's divine energy or confuse the womb. It is not unlike today's fertility clinics handing couples a brochure, except theirs involved oil lamps, guarded doors, and priests holding chalk. Over the centuries, some scrolls were lost, damaged by fire or theft. Others were intentionally destroyed during periods of moral reform when later dynasties sought to erase what they saw as indulgent or outdated. But a few survived. In recent decades, fragments have surfaced in archaeological digs, mostly near Thebes and Saqqara. Museums often classify them under coded categories like domestic life or medicinal illustration. Yet the context, once decoded, leaves little doubt about their purpose. For modern Egyptologists, these scrolls are challenging to interpret. Not because they are ambiguous, but because the modern lens sees eroticism as private, while the ancient one saw it as divine choreography. What we might blush at, the ancients might have knelt before, and what they feared, improper technique, misaligned bodies, sterile unions, we often dismiss as superstition. But for them, sex was not just a biological act. It was a prayer made with the body, and each movement was a line in that prayer. I find it strangely grounding that such rituals existed. It reminds me that throughout history, people have always tried to bring order to the mysteries of life in ways that reflect their time, their fears, and their hopes. The guards who once stood outside those ritual chambers are long gone. The couples who stared at those scrolls by lamplight never knew their most intimate moments would one day be discussed in academic circles. The scribes who drew those curved limbs and open mouths could not have imagined tourists peering at their work through museum glass. And yet here we are, still wondering what it all meant, still shocked by how far belief could carry the body. The story of ancient Egyptian sexuality is not just about strange practices. It is about how every part of human life, even the most private, was turned into a tool of power, worship, and healing. Pharaohs offered their bodies to the gods. Priestesses directed pleasure with the precision of a mathematician, and couples, desperate for a child, were told to mimic drawings no one else was allowed to see. So we end here, where ink met skin, where ritual met desire, where temples guarded not just treasure but knowledge too strange for the public. It is a reminder that in the ancient world, no boundary between sacred and physical was truly fixed. Everything touched everything else. Tonight, close your eyes not just on a strange history, but on the quiet truth behind it, that even in a world ruled by gods and gold, it was still human longing that shaped the rituals we now find so bizarre. Sleep well, and may your dreams be a little stranger tonight